Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we step into landscapes where damp fog clings to your coat, the marsh reeds of Brandenburg whisper, and you feel your boots sink slightly in soil that seems stubbornly reluctant to dry. This is the soil that once cradled a minor electorate, a place few in the 17th century would have bet on to become the backbone of a kingdom that would shape Europe. You're in a realm where the winters are unforgiving. The nobles squabble like cats in a barn, and the peasants work endlessly with barely a break. You probably won't survive this, at least not if you're imagining yourself trudging through the muck without proper boots, because malaria swarms out here were once as common as a brewery in Munich. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And go ahead, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see this sleepy little community stretching across time zones like flickering lanterns. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk across the bleak plain, and at first you wonder why anyone would fight for this. Flat land, cold winds, a patchwork of rivers that flood too easily. Yet this is Brandenburg, the seed of Prussia, a place where survival demanded grim determination. Unlike the fertile fields of France or the rolling wealth of Italy, this was no land of plenty. Here, you count your blessings if the harvest isn't ruined by hail or raided by a neighbour with sharper pikes. You can almost hear the muttering of villagers in their thatched huts, their lives punctuated by church bells and the occasional terrifying news of Swedish raiders sweeping down the Oder. The early Hohenzollern electors, your hosts in this chilly territory, didn't inherit a golden crown but rather a giant mess. Think of them as landlords stuck with a house that leaks from the roof, groans in the floorboards, and comes with tenants who refuse to pay rent. They had to consolidate scattered provinces, Brandenburg here, bits of Prussia there, and remote outposts elsewhere that didn't even share a border. It's like inheriting a puzzle with half the pieces missing, except the missing ones are in someone else's castle. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, left this land scarred in ways you can still imagine if you close your eyes. Picture whole villages emptied, churches burned, fields trampled by endless soldiers with no loyalty beyond the next payday. Historians still argue whether Brandenburg lost a third or even half its population during those decades. Either way, you walk through silence where once children laughed. Skeletons of farmhouses lean against the horizon, and yet from this devastation, the Elector Frederick William, later known as the Great Elector, would set about forging something new. Frederick William was not the kind of man to inspire poetry. He wasn't tall, he wasn't dazzling, and his fashion sense, well, let's just say powdered wigs weren't his strong point. But what he lacked in glamour, he made up in grit. You watch him gather mercenaries, weld them into a disciplined standing army, and bargain with the Junkers, the landed nobles who controlled everything from law courts to the peasantry's bread supply. The deal was simple, if a little grim. You, the Junkers, keep your grip on the serfs, and I, the Elector, get to keep my soldiers in line. It wasn't exactly democracy, but it worked. Here's your first quirky tidbit. Brandenburg was so swampy that malaria remained a recurring nightmare into the 18th century. Imagine noble officers strutting around in polished boots, only to be laid low not by musket fire but by a mosquito bite. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it shaped where armies could march and where palaces could safely be built. You can almost hear the buzz in your ears as you swat at the air. As the 17th century crept forward, Frederick William's reforms began to show results. His army wasn't large compared to France's, but it was reliable, drilled to perfection, and utterly loyal to him. He brought in Dutch engineers to drain some of those cursed marshes, carving out farmland and raising dikes that stood defiantly against floods. When Swedish forces threatened in the 1650s, the Prussian troops fought back with a stubbornness that startled Europe. This was the iron beginning of a tradition. Small territory, harsh conditions, but soldiers who could punch above their weight. You lean against a rough wooden fence and look toward the east. Beyond Brandenburg lay Ducal Prussia, a fief technically under Polish suzerainty. It was like having a younger cousin who technically lived in someone else's house. Frederick William managed to secure sovereignty there through careful diplomacy in the 1657 Treaty of Wehlau. That meant he no longer had to kneel to the Polish king for that stretch of land. Imagine the satisfaction. like finally owning your own apartment instead of living under a landlord's constant eye. It was a modest gain, but it symbolised the first step toward independence and stature. Meanwhile, the social fabric of Brandenburg remained as rough as the wool cloaks of its peasants. Junkers rode high, their manors dotting the countryside, while peasants bent their backs in fields, bound by obligations that felt eternal. Towns were small, poor, and rarely able to challenge noble power. Yet in these shadows the state itself hardened. Frederick William's obsession with order laid foundations for something few foresaw, a kingdom defined not by luxury but by discipline. You pause to picture the elector at his desk, scratching quills across parchment, balancing ledgers with almost obsessive neatness. He squeezed taxes out of merchants, imported Dutch settlers to boost the economy, and quietly centralised authority. Still, historians debate whether he was truly a visionary or simply a pragmatist cleaning up chaos. What is certain is that he gave Brandenburg a sense of direction. Survive first, prosper later. There's an irony you can't miss. While Baroque courts elsewhere glittered with operas and fountains, Brandenburg's rulers looked almost austere by comparison. If you wanted glamour, you went to Versailles. If you wanted discipline and survival, you came here. And maybe, just maybe, that austerity became its secret weapon. You don't build a war machine on frivolity. You build it on plain bread, strict drills, and the knowledge that no one else is coming to rescue you if you fail. The population began to recover slowly after the war. Fields reopened, new settlers came in, lured by promises of tax breaks. Refugees, especially Huguenots fleeing persecution in Catholic France, were welcomed, bringing with them skills in weaving, crafts and business. Walk through a Brandenburg town in the late 17th century, and you might hear French words mingling with German. Imagine delicate silk being woven in a place once defined by rough wool. It's a little cultural upgrade in the middle of Europe's bleak frontier, but the defining thread remains: militarization. Everywhere you turn there are drills, parades, inspections. Soldiers aren't just a defence force, they're the glue holding this ramshackle state together. Without them, the provinces might tear apart under noble rivalries. With them, Brandenburg Prussia begins to look like more than the sum of its soggy parts. A curious image comes to mind. Imagine the land as a battered old wagon. Other rulers might have gilded it with paint or filled it with cushions. The Hohenzollerns instead tightened the wheels, reinforced the axles, and made sure the horses could pull harder. It wasn't pretty, but it moved, and in moving it carried Prussia step by step toward kingship. By the end of the 17th century, the elector's son, Frederick III, would inherit this legacy. He was different, fancier, keener on titles and ceremony. In 1701 he crowned himself king in Prussia at Königsberg, wrangling imperial approval with hefty bribes and clever flattery. Note the wording. In Prussia, not of Prussia, because technically the Holy Roman Emperor wasn't thrilled about rivals. Still, the crown glittered, and suddenly the muddy electorate had a king. You can almost chuckle at the irony. The son who loved pomp became the first king, while the father who built the real strength never wore the crown. History's sense of humour can be cruel like that. But for you, walking through the echoing halls of the newly styled Prussian court, you sense that the true foundation wasn't the coronation ceremony. It was the iron system built earlier, in the silence after war, in the draining of marshes, in the cold bargaining with Junkers. As you leave the marshland behind, you notice the smell of wood smoke drifting through the night air, the faint sound of a soldier's boots on cobblestones, the stillness of a land learning how to stand tall. You know now, this was the beginning of Prussia's story. Not glamorous, not easy, but stubbornly enduring. And in that endurance, a monarchy was forged, one that would shape centuries to come. You carry the damp scent of Brandenburg's marshes with you, as the story glides onward, and suddenly the scene stiffens into order, boots striking cobblestones in perfect rhythm. You've stepped into the early 18th century now, into the reign of a monarch whose nickname tells you everything. Frederick William I, the soldier king. If you were hoping for candlelit banquets, delicate sonatas, and silk-draped courtiers, brace yourself for disappointment. This ruler's court felt less like Versailles and more like a relentless boot camp. The man valued two things above all else: soldiers and savings. You see him before you, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with a temper that flared faster than dry kindling. He could be terrifying, flashing eyes, booming voice, fists pounding a table, and yet there's something almost comical in his obsession. He loved his soldiers like other kings loved art collections. His favourite pastime wasn't commissioning a painting but drilling troops in parade squares, watching their muskets glint in the sun. He would pace up and down the line, barking commands, correcting the slightest wobble in a stance. You almost flinch when you imagine his glare falling on you, daring you to miss a beat. One mainstream fact every schoolbook repeats is that under Frederick William I, Prussia's army ballooned from a modest 38,000 men to nearly 80,000. That made it the fourth largest in Europe, despite Prussia being only the 13th largest state in terms of population. Picture a village where half the men are farmers and the other half march in uniform. That's the soldier king's dream realised. Every town square becomes a recruiting ground. Every harvest has to account for the fact that strong young men might be yanked into service. But here's a quirky tidbit. Frederick William developed a bizarre obsession with extremely tall soldiers. His famous Potsdam Giants, an elite regiment composed of men often over 6 feet, were gathered from across Europe like rare collectibles. Agents scoured villages for towering lads, even resorting to kidnapping. Imagine being a farmer in Ireland, standing head and shoulders above your peers, when suddenly you're whisked off to Prussia because a foreign king wants you in his parade of giants. There are stories of fathers in remote villages hiding their tall sons in cellars to prevent them from being abducted. And while Frederick William adored watching these lanky men march, historians still argue whether they were ever an effective fighting unit or just a living toy set for the king's amusement. The court itself shrank under this ruler. Gone were many of the frivolities his father, Frederick I, had adored. No more lavish masquerades, no endless fountains spraying in grand gardens. Instead, your senses are filled with the clatter of muskets, the creak of boots, the snarl of the king as he berates wastefulness. He wore simple uniforms rather than jewelled robes. Meals were hearty but plain, lots of cabbage, salted meats and beer. You get the impression that if you showed up in a powdered wig, he might rip it off your head himself. At first, you might think this joyless austerity would alienate people. Yet, strangely, it did the opposite. The common folk, long used to hard work and suspicion of luxury, began to identify with this gruff king. He was saving money, not spending it. He was building strength, not frittering it away. Taxes, though heavy, often went straight into maintaining the army that gave Prussia security and pride. You imagine a farmer's family, weary after harvest, watching soldiers march by and feeling, just for a moment, that their sacrifices meant something larger. Still, the soldier king was far from universally beloved. His temper could be brutal, especially with his family. His relationship with his son, the future Frederick the Great, became legendary for its ferocity. Picture the young prince longing for music, philosophy and French culture, only to be met with his father's thunderous contempt. At one point, Frederick William even tried to beat the foolishness out of him with a cane. It escalated to the point where the young Frederick attempted to flee Prussia entirely. When the plan was discovered, the enraged king executed Frederick's friend and fellow escapee Kater before the prince's eyes. Imagine the trauma of watching your closest companion die, while your father sneers that this is what happens to dreamers. Historians still argue whether Frederick William's harshness was cruelty or tough love that forged his son's later greatness. Either way, standing there in the shadow of the Potsdam Palace, you can almost hear the echoes of shouting matches, the slammed doors, the endless tension between father and son. It feels less like royal grandeur and more like a dysfunctional family drama played out on a national stage. Yet for all the chaos at home, Frederick William's policies outside the palace were transformative. He reorganised administration with ruthless efficiency. Bureaucrats were whipped into shape, corruption cut down, and systems standardised. He loved order so much that even street cleaning became a matter of state concern. You picture him stomping through Berlin, pointing angrily at a pile of garbage and threatening to conscript the whole neighbourhood if it isn't cleaned up immediately. Economically, he encouraged domestic production. He hated relying on imports, preferring Prussians to produce their own goods, from textiles to weapons. That obsession with self-reliance gave the kingdom a sturdy backbone, a sense that it could stand firm against external shocks. And all the while, the treasury swelled. Unlike many rulers who died leaving debts, Frederick William left his successor a full coffer. There's a strangely modern flavour to some of his practices. He insisted on frugality in government, cut down on unnecessary offices, and even audited expenditures personally. Imagine your boss popping into your cubicle and checking every receipt you filed, except this boss wears a uniform and has the power to throw you in prison. It's the kind of micromanagement that would drive you mad today, but somehow welded Prussia into one of Europe's most disciplined states. And yet, for all his obsession with soldiers, the soldier king rarely actually used them in battle. He avoided costly wars, preferring to preserve his army as a deterrent. Think of it like a kid who spends years building the ultimate Lego castle, but never plays with it because he doesn't want it broken. Some historians suggest this restraint preserved Prussia's strength for his son's spectacular campaigns. Others think it shows Frederick William was all bark and drill, lacking the nerve to test his army in true conflict. Again, debate lingers, and you stand in the middle of it, listening to scholars quarrel across centuries. One of the lighter, almost humorous aspects of his reign was his unpredictable generosity toward commoners. Yes, he could explode in rage, but he also had a knack for surprising kindness. There are stories of him wandering Berlin, chatting with shopkeepers, or rewarding a peasant with gold for honest service. You might bump into him at a tavern. He loved beer, and find him bellowing jokes with soldiers. This odd duality, tyrant at home, approachable in public, made him both feared and respected. You watch the Potsdam giants march once more, their heads towering above the crowd, muskets gleaming. Somewhere in the background, Frederick William is counting them, almost like a collector admiring rare coins. To him, these men weren't just soldiers. They were symbols of his obsession, the living embodiment of his strange iron vision. And in their shadow, Berlin itself begins to change, less a city of frivolity, more a garrison town where discipline is the highest virtue. As the years roll by, you see the king age. His temper doesn't soften, but his energy wanes. His son, Frederick, grows into a man, his love of philosophy undimmed, though scarred by the horrors of his youth. The court whispers that the prince will undo all his father's work, that the dream of Prussian strength will crumble. But you, standing here, know what comes next. The soldier king's foundation, grim, orderly, humourless, will give Frederick II the tools to dazzle Europe as Frederick the Great. Still, take a moment to picture the soldier king at his end. No pomp, no elaborate send-off. Just a stern man, uniform still his favourite garment, leaving behind not a glittering legacy, but a machine of state, efficient, disciplined, and frighteningly ready. He was never popular in the way Louis XIV was admired, nor beloved like England's merry monarch, but he carved a unique identity for Prussia. Where others displayed power, Prussia embodied it, like iron beneath the skin. As the drums fade into the night, you walk away from the parade ground. Your ears ring with the bark of orders, your eyes still dazzled by the towering figures of the Potsdam giants. You sense that something irreversible has been set in motion. The soldier king may have lacked charm, but he gave his realm teeth, muscles, and a backbone of steel. And with that he handed his son a kingdom poised to leap onto the stage of Europe. The drums of the soldier king's relentless parade still echo in your ears when the rhythm suddenly changes. The iron boots of Frederick William I fade, and in their place comes a lighter sound. Flutes, harpsichords, the soft chatter of philosophers debating in candle-lit salons. You're still in Prussia, but it no longer feels like the same grim garrison. You've entered the reign of Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great. He's the son who once tried to flee, the prince who watched his friend die under his father's wrath, and now the king who must rule a kingdom built on iron discipline. Step into his world, the mid-18th century, a time when Europe is buzzing with Enlightenment ideas. Everywhere, thinkers question tradition, probe the sciences, and propose radical notions about tolerance and rights. Frederick is drawn to this current like a moth to candlelight. He writes letters in elegant French, exchanges witty commentary with Voltaire, and dreams of ruling as a philosopher king. And yet, behind the salon charm and flute sonatas, he also inherits one of the fiercest military machines in Europe. That contradiction, artist and general, thinker and conqueror, defines his reign. You stand with him at Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam, his retreat from Berlin's formality. Its name means without care. and you can feel the deliberate contrast with his father's boot camp. Vineyards climb the terraces, statues gaze serenely, and inside the air is filled with music. Frederick adored playing the flute. He composed more than 100 sonatas and concertos. Picture him in a simple uniform, flute raised, eyes closed, while courtiers listen in respectful silence. If you expected gold crowns and endless pomp, here you find intimacy, culture, and a strange blend of austerity and elegance. But don't be fooled. Frederick was no gentle dreamer lost in melody. Almost immediately after taking the throne in 1740, he revealed the other half of his nature, the strategist, the conqueror, the gambler. His eyes fixed on Silesia, a wealthy Habsburg province. To most rulers, attacking the powerful Austrian Empress Maria Theresa would have seemed suicidal. Frederick, however, calculated differently. He knew Prussia's army was razor-sharp thanks to his father's reforms, and he saw Silesia's rich mines and lands as the key to transforming Prussia into a major power. So he struck. The War of the Austrian Succession began, and suddenly the philosopher king turned into a warrior king. You can almost hear the thunder of cannons at Mollwitz in 1741, where Prussian discipline triumphed over Austrian cavalry. The victory shocked Europe. Who were these upstart Prussians daring to challenge the venerable Habsburg dynasty? The answer: a kingdom that had grown lean, mean, and hungry under the soldier king, now led by a monarch brilliant enough to wield it. The First and Second Silesian Wars, 1740 to 1745, secured Frederick's prize. Prussia held Silesia, enriching its economy and boosting its prestige. From now on, no one could dismiss Prussia as a backwater garrison. It was a contender in the high-stakes game of European politics. Frederick became the Great not because he was loved. Many despised his arrogance, but because he made Prussia matter. Yet his reign wasn't all triumph. The real test came with the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, often called the First World War, because it stretched from Europe to colonies across the globe. Frederick's position looked hopeless. Austria, France, and Russia all allied against him. Prussia was encircled, outnumbered, and dwarfed in resources. It's like walking into a bar fight where everyone hates you, and most of them are bigger than you. And yet, against the odds, Frederick held out. At Rossbach in 1757, his smaller force demolished a combined French and Austrian army, stunning observers. At Leuthen, he outmanoeuvred the Austrians with dazzling tactical brilliance, shifting his troops like a chess master moving pieces. You can almost see him on horseback, surveying the battlefield with hawk-like eyes, issuing commands that seemed reckless but worked with uncanny precision. For a while, he looked invincible. But the war dragged on, grinding Prussia down. Cities were ravaged, soldiers exhausted, and Frederick himself wrote despairing letters, admitting he was nearly finished. And then, like something out of a novel, salvation came. In 1762, the Russian Empress Elizabeth died, and her successor, Peter III, idolized Frederick. Russia suddenly pulled out of the war, saving Prussia from collapse. Historians still argue whether Frederick would have survived without this miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Perhaps his skill alone might not have been enough, but with that stroke of fortune he emerged battered but unbeaten, Silesia still in his grasp, Prussia still standing tall. When the smoke cleared, Frederick's reputation soared. Even his enemies respected him. Voltaire, despite later quarrels, once praised him as the embodiment of the enlightened despot. Philosophers admired his tolerance for religious minorities. He famously said that in his realm, everyone can get to heaven in his own fashion. You walk through Berlin and see Catholics, Protestants, and Jews coexisting with fewer restrictions than in many other states. Refugees still found welcome here, continuing the tradition started by his grandfather, the Great Elector. Still, his tolerance had limits. He valued usefulness over equality. If you contributed to the state, through skills, taxes, or loyalty, you were tolerated. If not, don't expect much warmth. He saw himself as the first servant of the state, a ruler who existed to strengthen Prussia above all. That phrase, first servant of the state, sounds noble, but it meant Frederick's love for Prussia outweighed any concern for individual liberty. You can almost hear him mutter that rights are fine, but they don't drill soldiers or pay for cannon. On the domestic front, Frederick modernised administration, encouraged agriculture and promoted education. He drained swamps, planted potatoes, and reformed the legal code. Yes, potatoes. You might laugh, but he was so determined to make his people adopt them that he planted royal fields and guarded them with soldiers, knowing peasants would assume anything so protected must be valuable and steal them for themselves. To this day, the potato is associated with Prussian practicality. Imagine an enlightened monarch scheming like a reverse psychology parent. Don't eat these potatoes, they're only for the king. Of course, everyone wanted them after that. Despite his Enlightenment friendships, Frederick could be ruthless. He censored works critical of the state, suppressed uprisings harshly, and kept the Junker nobility tightly bound to military service. For all his wit and charm in correspondence, he was notoriously cold in person. Courtiers described him as distant, sarcastic, and quick to cut others down. You might picture Voltaire basking in Frederick's letters, only to arrive at Sans Souci and feel the sting of the king's sharp tongue. His personal life remains a topic of speculation. Frederick married, reluctantly under his father's pressure, but never lived with his wife, instead keeping her at a separate palace. He surrounded himself with male companions, and while historians debate the nature of these relationships, whispers about his orientation have lingered for centuries. Some argue that the trauma of his youth, especially the execution of his friend Carter, shaped his distance from intimacy. Others suggest he simply married his true passion, the state itself. Walk through Sans Souci's halls again, and you feel the contradictions. A monarch who adored music and philosophy, yet who spent most of his life at war. A king who promoted tolerance, yet ruled autocratically. A man who composed delicate flute concertos, yet commanded bloody battles where thousands fell. You wonder how he reconciled it, or if he ever did. Perhaps that's why he named his retreat Without Care, to create at least the illusion of peace in a life otherwise defined by conflict. By the time he died in 1786, Frederick had reigned for 46 years. He left Prussia vastly expanded, its prestige sky high, its institutions stronger than ever. He had turned a provincial kingdom into a European power, laying the groundwork for the role Prussia would later play in unifying Germany. Yet he left no heirs. His legacy was not in family but in statecraft. He was buried simply beside his beloved dogs, as if to remind everyone that beneath the grandeur he remained a solitary figure. You linger at his grave, the stone plain, the site often decorated with potatoes left by visitors. The gesture is humorous, yet strangely touching, a tribute to the king who introduced the crop with such crafty persistence. It's a reminder that even great conquerors are remembered not just for wars, but for the small, quirky details of daily life. And so, you walk away from Sans Souci, the sound of a flute fading into the night air, mingling with the distant thunder of cannons. Frederick the Great has left his mark. Prussia is no longer a marginal state on soggy ground. It is a force to be reckoned with, admired, feared, and envied. You sense that the kingdom is poised for an even greater role in European destiny, though not without turbulence. As you step onward, you carry the image of a man forever balancing contradictions. Philosopher and soldier, artist and tyrant, lonely soul and national hero. That is Frederick's crown, and it gleams with both brilliance and shadow. The echo of Frederick's flute drifts into silence, and the ground beneath your feet softens. The clang of Prussian muskets fades, and instead you hear the toll of church bells rolling across valleys. You've wandered southward now, into Bavaria, no longer the austere garrison state of the north, but a Catholic land where faith and tradition mingle with beer foam and baroque splendour. Here the air smells not of gunpowder and cabbage, but of incense, roasted meats, and malted grain. The Prussians might have drilled themselves into steel, but Bavaria cultivated something different, a Catholic heartland wrapped in pageantry, devotion, and stubborn independence. You enter Munich, the Bavarian capital, sometime in the 17th century. The skyline is punctuated by onion-domed church towers, their bells calling the faithful to Mass. Step inside, and you are bathed in gold light. Frescoed ceilings depicting saints in dramatic, swirling clouds, and altars laden with candles. Bavarians believed in making faith visible. If Prussia's strength was in visible discipline, Bavaria's was a glowing spectacle of Catholic resilience. Remember, this was the frontier of the Reformation Wars. Protestantism had swept much of northern Germany, but Bavaria stood proudly Catholic, spearheaded by its ruling Wittelsbach dynasty. Mainstream fact: during the 30 Years' War, the Dukes of Bavaria emerged as champions of Catholicism. Maximilian I, who ruled from 1597 to 1651, became one of the most powerful princes in the Holy Roman Empire. His forces fought alongside Habsburg armies, securing major victories like the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. That battle crushed the Protestant rebellion in Bohemia and reaffirmed Catholic dominance in Central Europe. You can almost hear the clash of pikes on that snowy hillside, Bavarian banners flying with the Virgin Mary emblazoned across them. But Bavaria's Catholicism wasn't just politics, it soaked into daily life. Festivals revolved around saints' days, harvest was celebrated with processions, and even the architecture screamed devotion. Wander into a small village, and the maypole rising in the square is painted with Catholic symbols. Beer halls might be lively, but even they often displayed crucifixes above the door. It was faith not tucked away in private, but worn proudly on sleeve and stein alike. And speaking of beer, here's a quirky tidbit. Bavaria gave the world the Reinheitsgebot, or beer purity law, first proclaimed in 1516. It dictated that beer could only be brewed with water, barley and hops. Yeast wasn't even understood yet. While today it sounds like regulatory trivia, back then it was serious business. Beer was daily nutrition, safer than water in many places, and a symbol of Bavarian identity. The purity law became a point of pride, something Bavarians still toast to 5 centuries later. So when you take a sip in a Munich tavern, you're tasting not just malt but history. Now, Bavaria was wealthy compared to Brandenburg. Its lands were fertile, its towns bustling with trade, its culture rich in art and music. The Wittelsbach rulers poured fortunes into constructing grand palaces and ornate churches. Walk through the Residenz in Munich, and you're dazzled by gilded halls, intricate stucco work and vast galleries meant to impress both subjects and rivals. Unlike the Prussians, who prided themselves on frugality, the Bavarians embraced spectacle. If Versailles was France's jewel, Munich aspired to be a southern German mirror. But with grandeur came contradictions. The same rulers who championed Catholic virtue were often knee-deep in worldly intrigues. Court scandals, backroom alliances and lavish expenditures peppered Wittelsbach history. Historians still argue whether Maximilian I's devotion was purely spiritual or conveniently political, aimed at securing his family's grip on power. Was he a true son of the Counter-Reformation, or simply a shrewd prince who knew Catholic loyalty could buy Habsburg favour? Perhaps it was both. Faith and politics twined together like hops in a Bavarian brew. As the centuries rolled forward, Bavaria maintained this dual identity, staunchly Catholic, fiercely proud, and yet entangled in the messy chessboard of European politics. It often found itself tugged between Austria and France, its rulers manoeuvring for advantage. You picture the Elector of Bavaria at a candlelit desk, quill scratching out treaties, trying to ensure his duchy-turned electorate didn't get swallowed by neighbours. Unlike Prussia, which built power through relentless discipline, Bavaria relied on negotiation, culture and the occasional well-timed military gamble. Step outside Munich into the countryside, and life feels different from Prussia's grim drill grounds. Rolling hills are dotted with monasteries, many of them wealthy, their monks brewing beer or distilling schnapps. Pilgrimage churches rise in unexpected places, adorned with rococo curves and pastel colours that feel almost whimsical compared to Prussia's dour churches. Farmers here are bound to their land, yes, but their festivals and village life carry a warmth, a rhythm tuned more to the church calendar than the military timetable. And oh, the music. Bavaria was alive with it. Sacred choirs, folk dances and orchestral compositions echoed from court to countryside. While Prussia's Frederick the Great played his flute mostly in private, Bavarian rulers loved public pageantry. You imagine processions where brass bands blared, fireworks lit the skies, and townsfolk feasted until the early hours. In a land where winters were cold and wars frequent, these festivals offered release, a collective reassurance that life could still be joyful. One of the more curious aspects of Bavarian culture was its blending of faith with folklore. Villagers might carry rosaries in their pockets, but also leave offerings to local spirits. or consult wise women for remedies. Catholicism didn't erase older traditions. It absorbed them, much like how Christmas trees carried pagan roots but thrived under Christian blessing. You picture a village elder sprinkling holy water on cattle one moment and whispering an old incantation the next. Faith here wasn't just dogma, it was woven into daily survival. Politically, Bavaria's fortunes rose and fell. The War of the Spanish Succession in the early 1700s proved disastrous. Elector Maximilian II, Emmanuel gambled on an alliance with France against the Habsburgs, dreaming of becoming King of Spain. Instead, Bavaria was occupied by Austrian forces, Munich stripped, and its ruler exiled. Imagine the humiliation. Palaces ransacked, noble families scattered, and the proud Catholic heartland humbled. But like a stubborn oak, Bavaria endured, regaining stability in later decades. By the 18th century, Bavaria had become both a cultural beacon and a political balancing act. Its rulers continued to patronise the arts, filling galleries with paintings and commissioning composers. At the same time, they struggled to keep independence amid the growing power of Prussia and Austria. Stand in the Hofbräuhaus beer hall, the air thick with smoke and laughter, and you'll hear tavern songs laced with both pride and anxiety. Bavaria was rich, proud, and pious, but it was also vulnerable. And here's another quirky fringe-like tidbit. In the 18th century, secret societies began to stir in Bavaria, none more infamous than the Illuminati, founded in Ingolstadt in 1776. While their actual influence remains debated, their very origin in staunchly Catholic Bavaria seems almost paradoxical. In a land dominated by church and tradition, a group emerged preaching reason, enlightenment, and even revolution. It's like finding a jazz band in the middle of a monastery choir, jarring, but a reminder that Bavaria was never entirely monolithic. As you wander further into the Bavarian landscape, you feel the difference in atmosphere compared to Prussia. Here, survival was not forged in marshes and drills, but in festivals, faith, and resilience. The people carried their Catholic identity like a shield, but they also laughed, sang, and brewed their way through hardship. Their rulers, the Wittelsbachs, might have been flawed, but they provided a sense of continuity, tying Bavaria's identity to both heaven and earth. By the end of the 18th century, Bavaria stood as a kingdom in all but name, ready to be crowned in the coming Napoleonic upheavals. Its Catholic heart still beat strong, its beer still flowed, and its churches still gleamed. Yet storm clouds gathered. Revolution in France, wars across Europe, and the rise of new empires threatened to sweep even this resilient land into chaos. For now, though, as you sit in a Munich tavern, stein in hand, listening to the mingling sounds of laughter and church bells, you feel the pulse of Bavaria's Catholic heartland. Faith, festivity, and a stubborn will to endure. This is Bavaria, and it beats to a rhythm very different from Prussia's drum. The bells of Munich still ring faintly in your ears, but as you drift deeper into Bavaria's story, the sound blends with the rustle of silk gowns and the clink of crystal goblets. You are no longer in the village square watching monks bless cattle, or peasants dance around a maypole. Instead, you step into palaces where chandeliers drip with light, where frescoes stretch across ceilings so high your neck aches to admire them, and where the ruling Wittelsbach dynasty staged its long theatre of power. This is not Prussia's iron drill ground. It is a world of splendour, spectacle, and occasional scandal, the kind that made Bavaria famous across Europe for more than its beer. The Wittelsbach family had ruled Bavaria since the Middle Ages, their roots stretching back to the 13th century. By the early modern era, they had become one of the most enduring dynasties in Europe, outlasting countless rivals. Think of them like oak trees, sometimes battered by storms, sometimes losing branches, but always rooted deep. And like oaks, they spread wide, marrying into many European royal houses. The family's very longevity gave Bavaria a sense of identity. No matter what war raged outside, the Wittelsbachs remained at the helm, sometimes stern, sometimes frivolous, but always unmistakably themselves. You wander into the Munich Residenz, their primary palace, and it's hard not to be dazzled. Room after room unfolds, the antiquarium, a vast Renaissance hall with classical statues glaring down at you, the glittering hall of mirrors, reflecting candlelight in endless dazzle, the throne rooms where velvet drapes brush polished marble floors. Here the Wittelsbachs hosted ambassadors, artists, generals, and anyone they needed to impress. Bavaria might have been smaller than Austria or France, but when guests walked these halls they knew the dynasty meant to stand among Europe's great. Mainstream fact. The Wittelsbachs were major patrons of the arts. Duke Albrecht V in the 16th century collected books and manuscripts obsessively, laying the foundations for what became the Bavarian State Library, today one of the largest in the world. Later rulers poured resources into paintings, music and architecture. Without them, Munich might not have developed its reputation as a cultural capital. Their sponsorship attracted talent from Italy, the Low Countries and beyond, turning Bavaria into a crossroads of artistic styles. But the story of Wittelsbach's splendour isn't only one of noble patronage. It's also filled with quirks, contradictions, and the occasional juicy scandal. Here's a tidbit that might raise your eyebrows. Duke Wilhelm V, ruling in the late 16th century, was so devoutly Catholic that he funded countless churches and schools, earning praise for his piety. Yet his extravagance nearly bankrupted Bavaria. When debts piled too high, he conveniently abdicated in 1597, retreating to a monastery while leaving his son to clean up the mess. Imagine a modern CEO resigning after lavish spending, only to vanish into a quiet retreat, sipping wine while his successor scrambles to balance the books. The 17th century brought Maximilian I, the master strategist of the 30 Years' War. He wasn't content with piety alone. He manoeuvred politically with remarkable skill, elevating Bavaria to electoral status in 1623. That meant the Wittelsbachs gained one of the coveted votes for choosing the Holy Roman Emperor. Maximilian's gamble tied Bavaria's fate tightly to Catholic Habsburg Austria, but it also lifted the dynasty's prestige. You can almost see him, pen in hand, plotting alliances by candlelight, a rosary dangling from his wrist as much for politics as for prayer. Historians still argue whether Maximilian's legacy was brilliance or recklessness. His devotion kept Bavaria Catholic, yes, but his wars also left villages scorched and peasants destitute. Splendour for the dynasty often came at a high price for the common folk. Step into the 18th century, and you find Wittelsbach rulers indulging even more in the trappings of courtly culture. Maximilian II Emmanuel, for example, had grand ambitions. He dreamed of ruling not just Bavaria but perhaps Spain, marrying into powerful houses and allying with France. He built extravagant palaces, including the Nymphenburg Palace, a sprawling summer residence filled with Rococo charm. Walk its gardens today and you still hear the whisper of fountains, the rustle of powdered wigs, the soft murmur of secret court intrigues. But Max Emanuel's gamble during the War of the Spanish Succession backfired spectacularly. When Austria crushed Bavaria at Blenheim in 1704, the once splendid dreamer was forced into exile and Bavaria was occupied by Austrian troops. His palaces stood silent, halls echoing with absence while villagers bore the brunt of war's devastation. For all the splendour of the Wittelsbachs, their ambitions sometimes plunged the land into misery. And then there was Karl Theodor, who ruled later in the 18th century. He inherited Bavaria not by direct succession, but through dynastic twists of fate. He had been Elector Palatine and suddenly found himself wearing Bavaria's crown in 1777. The Bavarians weren't thrilled. He was seen as distant, more interested in art and mistresses than in governing their land. His rule sparked jokes that he was more Elector of theatres than Elector of Bavaria. Yet, ironically, he left behind a rich cultural legacy, commissioning opera houses and supporting science. Walk through Munich's National Theatre and you can thank Karl Theodor's taste, even if his politics were lacklustre. One of the most fascinating quirks of Wittelsbach culture was their love of masquerade balls and elaborate festivities. These weren't just parties, they were stages where power was displayed, alliances forged, and identities playfully swapped. Picture nobles in glittering masks spinning across polished floors under crystal chandeliers, while whispers of politics slip through laughter. In a world of rigid hierarchies, masquerades allowed momentary freedom. A duke might flirt with a commoner disguised as a princess. A general might dance in costume, forgetting for a night the weight of campaigns. It was both frivolous and dangerous, a reminder that behind the polished facade, human desires tugged restlessly. Meanwhile, the common people of Bavaria observed this splendour with mixed feelings. Festivals sponsored by the Wittelsbachs provided joy. Parades, fireworks, and free beer could lighten anyone's spirits. But taxes to support such excesses weighed heavily. A farmer in Upper Bavaria might cheer at a public feast yet grumble when officials collected dues to fund another palace renovation. This tension between princely splendour and peasant burden was a thread running through Bavaria's history, a seesaw of pride and resentment. The Enlightenment did not pass Bavaria by. By the late 18th century, ideas of reform and reason trickled even into the Wittelsbach courts. Some rulers experimented with modernising reforms, better administration, investment in education, attempts to loosen feudal constraints. But progress was slow, tangled in the weight of tradition and the Church's powerful influence. Historians debate how genuinely committed the Wittelsbachs were to Enlightenment ideals. Were they true reformers, or did they dabble in fashionable philosophy while clinging to old privileges? The answer, as always, lies somewhere in between. Let's not forget the art. Without Wittelsbach patronage, Munich would lack much of its cultural lustre. Painters like Peter Paul Rubens left their mark here, and music thrived under ducal support. Court theatres staged operas that rivaled those in Vienna. You might sit in a velvet-lined box watching a performance by candlelight, while the elector nods approvingly nearby, enjoying both the spectacle and the prestige it brought his court. Splendour wasn't just decoration. It was a tool of legitimacy, a way for Bavaria to say to Europe, "We belong among the great." And yet, even as splendour glittered in the palaces, the shadows of decline grew. By the late 18th century, Bavaria was increasingly a pawn in great powers' games. The Austrians eyed it greedily, the Prussians sought alliances, and Napoleon's shadow loomed on the horizon. The Wittelsbachs, with all their culture and masks, would soon face the test of survival, in an age when old dynasties toppled. But for now, let yourself linger in the Hall of Mirrors. Candle flames flicker endlessly in reflection. Laughter swells as masked dancers spin, and a harpsichord plays a melody that seems to float above the weight of politics. The Wittelsbachs may not have commanded iron discipline like the Hohenzollerns, but their splendour carved out its own kind of power, a dazzling, precarious theatre of legitimacy, fragile as glass but beautiful while it lasted. The glitter of masquerade masks fades into the shadows of candlelight, and when your eyes adjust, you find yourself alone on a winding Bavarian mountain road. The air is colder here, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and damp stone. Above you, the silhouette of a castle clings impossibly to the cliffs, turrets piercing the sky like frozen music. This is Neuschwanstein, the most famous of Bavaria's fairy tale castles, the dream of a monarch remembered as both visionary and mad, King Ludwig II. Born in 1845, Ludwig inherited the throne of Bavaria at just 18 years old. The world expected another Wittelsbach prince shaped by Catholic tradition and courtly ritual. Instead, they got something altogether different, a shy, romantic youth more interested in Wagner's operas and medieval legends than in governance. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1864, Ludwig seemed to walk on a stage of his own making, where the rules of politics mattered less than beauty, imagination, and solitude. You watch him at his coronation, tall and handsome, blue eyes intense, his uniform impeccable. The crowd cheers, but Ludwig barely registers them. Already his mind is elsewhere, drifting toward visions of heroic knights, enchanted swans, and dream worlds untouched by parliament or bureaucracy. He was a monarch in the age of realpolitik, but his heart lived in the pages of legend. Mainstream fact: Ludwig II became one of the most notorious patrons of the composer Richard Wagner. The young king idolized him, seeing in Wagner's operas a reflection of his own longing for transcendence. He summoned Wagner to Munich, lavished him with funds, and defended him against scandal and debt. Without Ludwig's support, some of Wagner's greatest works, like Tristan und Isolde or the monumental Ring Cycle, might never have reached the stage. In this sense, Ludwig's obsession shaped the course of music history. But Ludwig's passions came at a cost. He had little interest in day-to-day governance, leaving ministers frustrated. He preferred to retreat into fantasy, surrounding himself with Wagner's music, medieval poetry, and architectural plans. And oh, the castles, those impossible, dazzling castles. Neuschwanstein, perched high in the Bavarian Alps, was designed as a tribute to the operatic world Wagner created. Inside, murals depicted scenes from Lohengrin and Tannhäuser. Corridors twisted like dreamscapes, and every window framed views of mountains that seemed to belong to myth rather than reality. Here's your quirky tidbit. Ludwig loved swans, so much so that he filled his palaces with swan motifs, from carved handles to painted murals. The swan became his personal emblem, tied to Wagner's opera Lohengrin. At Neuschwanstein, swans appear everywhere, as if Ludwig wanted to inhabit a perpetual fairy tale where birds were guardians of his soul. Even his childhood home, Hohenschwangau Castle, had swan imagery, feeding the obsession that lasted his entire life. But while the castle sparkled, Bavaria's treasury groaned. Ludwig poured staggering sums into construction. Linderhof, a palace modelled after Versailles. Herrenchiemsee, a half-finished replica of the Sun King's residence built on an island. And of course Neuschwanstein, which remained incomplete at his death. Ministers despaired. Taxes could not keep up with his dreams. Creditors grew impatient. Ludwig, however, waved off their complaints. "I want to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others," he once wrote. Governance, budgets, and politics seemed to him trivial compared to beauty. And yet, Ludwig wasn't entirely disconnected from reality. He was deeply aware of Bavaria's vulnerable position in the new German Empire. In 1871, Prussia's Bismarck manoeuvred Bavaria into joining the empire, crowning the Prussian king as Kaiser Wilhelm I in Versailles. Ludwig's role was marginal. He signed the necessary agreements but stayed withdrawn, humiliated that his kingdom had been subsumed. He preferred to retreat further into his castles rather than confront the loss of sovereignty. Historians still argue whether his retreat was cowardice, resistance, or simply the only refuge he knew. Meanwhile, his people developed mixed feelings. Some adored him, calling him the fairy tale king for his dedication to art and beauty. Others muttered angrily about the taxes and debts piling up. Ministers began to see him not as a patron of culture, but as a liability to the state. The tension grew sharper as Ludwig withdrew further, refusing audiences, spending nights wandering his castles by candlelight and holding dinners where he was the only guest at a table set for dozens. His eccentricities became legendary. He avoided public appearances, preferring nocturnal rides through forests or sleigh journeys in moonlight, wrapped in furs. He had elaborate meals delivered to him in ingenious contraptions, so he could dine without servants watching. He built grottos inside palaces, complete with artificial lakes and coloured lighting, where he could drift in a boat listening to Wagner's music. You can picture him gliding through this artificial cave, candlelight flickering on water, pretending for a moment that he had escaped into myth. And then, the whispers of madness. Was Ludwig insane, or merely misunderstood? Court physicians debated, ministers schemed. His behaviour was undoubtedly eccentric, but true madness is harder to prove. Some saw a visionary lost in dreams, others saw a king unfit to rule. Historians still argue whether he suffered from a mental illness, from depression, or simply from the crushing isolation of monarchy. In 1886, matters came to a head. Ministers moved against him, declaring him unfit to rule. A panel of doctors, some who had never even examined him directly, signed off on his deposition. His uncle was poised to take over. Ludwig was arrested at Neuschwanstein and taken to Berg Castle near Lake Starnberg. It felt like a betrayal. His ministers, his family, the very state he had adorned with beauty turning against him. Then, the mystery. On June 13th, 1886, Ludwig and his physician, Dr. Guden, went for a walk along the lake. Hours later, both were found dead in shallow water. The official story claimed suicide by drowning, but questions have haunted the tale ever since. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. The water was waist deep. Why was his doctor also dead with no struggle apparent? Was it suicide, murder, or accident? Historians, conspiracy theorists, and romantics all keep debating. Some whisper he was silenced to prevent his return. Others argue despair finally crushed him. The truth remains hidden beneath the still waters of Lake Starnberg. Today, Ludwig II is remembered less for politics than for his castles. Neuschwanstein, with its turrets and murals, became the model for Disney's Cinderella Castle, an icon of fantasy worldwide. Tourists flock from every corner of the globe to wander halls Ludwig himself rarely enjoyed. His debts, long since paid, his dreams, immortalised in stone. Bavaria, once angry at his extravagance, now celebrates him as a cultural treasure. You linger before Neuschwanstein, its white towers glowing in twilight. The mountains cradle it like a jewel, waterfalls tumble nearby, and the whole scene feels unreal. You imagine Ludwig inside, wandering empty corridors, the sound of Wagner echoing in chambers meant for audiences that never came. Alone, always alone, surrounded by beauty but consumed by longing. Was he mad? Was he visionary? Perhaps both. Perhaps that's why his story endures, because it embodies the fragile line between genius and madness, dream and despair. As night deepens, you feel the chill of the mountain air, the silence of the castle looming over you. Ludwig's story is no mere fairy tale. It is tragedy, brilliance, and mystery fused together, a reminder that monarchs could be as fragile as the dreams they built. And in Bavaria, his castles still whisper his name, swan feathers drifting on the wind. The moonlight fades from Neuschwanstein's towers, and when you step away from Ludwig's dreamscape, the air changes. It feels less enchanted, more practical, more ordinary. You're heading southwest now, into Württemberg, a land without Bavaria's dazzling Catholic splendour, without Prussia's iron drills. Instead, it is vineyards climbing gentle hills, small courts humming with protocol, and dukes who must manoeuvre carefully between larger, hungrier neighbours. Here, power grows modestly, not in spectacular leaps, but in cautious, steady steps, like vines slowly twining their way up a trellis. Württemberg, compared to Bavaria or Prussia, might seem minor at first glance. Tucked in the Swabian region, it lacked sprawling fertile plains or glittering capitals. Stuttgart, the ducal seat, was no Berlin or Munich. It felt more provincial, its palaces smaller, its ceremonies less extravagant. And yet, Württemberg endured. Through alliances, careful politics, and a knack for survival, it carved out a space in the jigsaw puzzle of the Holy Roman Empire. Mainstream fact: Württemberg rose to prominence in 1495, when Count Eberhard V was elevated to duke by Emperor Maximilian I. This moment gave the family new stature, cementing their place among the German nobility. You can imagine the pride in Stuttgart's streets, processions, banners, the clatter of hooves as the Count became a duke. For a modest territory, such elevation was both honour and opportunity, though it also brought heavier responsibilities. But Württemberg's story was never one of uninterrupted strength. Its rulers faced constant challenges, from restless nobles, meddling emperors, and foreign invaders. The land itself was not immune to devastation. The 30 Years' War tore through Württemberg as harshly as Brandenburg, leaving villages burned, fields abandoned, and populations decimated. In some regions, only 1/3 of the pre-war population survived. Imagine walking through charred ruins, silence hanging heavy where once bells rang and children laughed. The scars of that war lingered for generations, and yet Württemberg adapted. Unlike Prussia's Junkers, who consolidated iron control, Württemberg developed a tradition of negotiation. The dukes could not rule without the cooperation of local estates, assemblies of nobles, clergy, and even burghers who had a say in taxation and governance. It was far from democracy, but it created a culture where rulers bargained rather than dictated. You picture a ducal council chamber, heavy oak tables, scrolls unfurled, dukes leaning forward while representatives argue about grain prices, levies, and rights. Less glamorous than Versailles, but in its way, just as important. Here's a quirky tidbit. Württemberg's vineyards gave rise to some of Germany's earliest wine regulations. In a land of rolling hills and careful farming, wine was both livelihood and identity. The dukes occasionally issued decrees about planting, harvests, and even how much wine could be sold in taverns. Imagine a ruler less concerned with giant regiments or glittering opera houses than with making sure nobody watered down the local red. Even today, Swabian wine culture carries that sense of careful stewardship. Religion shaped Württemberg profoundly. Unlike Catholic Bavaria, Württemberg became a Protestant stronghold. Duke Ulrich, after a tumultuous career marked by exile and return, embraced Lutheranism in the 16th century, making it the official faith of his lands. Churches were stripped of their Catholic ornamentation, monasteries secularised, and a Lutheran identity rooted itself in the region. This Protestant tradition gave Württemberg a sense of distinction, setting it apart from neighbouring Catholic states and binding it closer to broader Protestant alliances. Yet, the switch also caused friction with imperial authorities and neighbouring Catholic princes. You might stand in a plain Lutheran church here, bare walls echoing, and sense the deliberate contrast with Bavaria's gilded altars. Despite its modest scale, Württemberg often punched above its weight in intellectual life. The University of Tübingen became a centre of theology and scholarship, training pastors, jurists and thinkers who spread influence across Germany. By the 18th century, Württemberg produced philosophers, poets and scientists who contributed to the Enlightenment currents rippling through Europe. The land's reputation for earnestness, practicality and education grew, even as its rulers juggled fragile politics. Historians still argue about Württemberg's character. Was it backward, provincial, always overshadowed? Or was it a model of resilience, cultivating culture and governance quietly, while louder states stole the headlines? The truth is likely both. Württemberg never dazzled like Bavaria or dominated like Prussia, but its modest rise ensured survival, and survival itself was no small achievement in a Europe of shifting empires. The dukes themselves were not immune to drama. Ulrich, for instance, was deposed for misrule in 1519, only to claw his way back into power with help from Protestant allies. Later rulers sometimes clashed with the estates, attempting to impose more centralised control, but they rarely succeeded fully. That constant push and pull became part of Württemberg's DNA. Unlike Prussia, where rulers imposed order from above, Württemberg grew through negotiation, compromise and stubborn local traditions. Step into Stuttgart in the 18th century and you'd see a court trying to keep up appearances. The Neues Schloss, New Palace, begun in 1746, was an attempt to match the grandeur of Versailles. Its sweeping facade, vast staircases and grand halls signalled ambition, yet the project strained finances and completion dragged on. You imagine a duke showing guests the half-finished palace, smiling tightly, hoping they wouldn't notice the debts piling up behind the plaster. Meanwhile, daily life in Württemberg carried a quieter rhythm. Peasants worked the fields, towns bustled with crafts, and guilds enforced traditions. Festivals marked the seasons, harvest fairs, wine celebrations, and Lutheran holy days filled calendars. Unlike Bavaria's Catholic processions or Prussia's military parades, Württemberg's festivities felt more local, more rooted in village identity. You might join a crowd in a market square, drinking local wine, listening to fiddlers play, children darting underfoot, the duke's presence distant but still hovering in symbols and decrees. Quirky detail. Württemberg developed a reputation for thrift, some would say stinginess. Travellers from elsewhere sometimes mocked Swabians for being too careful with money, too practical, too earnest. Yet this prudence helped the land endure. While Bavaria squandered funds on masquerades and Ludwig II's castles nearly bankrupted the treasury centuries later, Württemberg's rulers usually kept spending in check. Practicality may not glitter, but it pays bills. By the late 18th century, Württemberg, like its neighbours, faced the tremors of change. Enlightenment ideas pressed harder, reforms trickled in, and questions of sovereignty loomed as larger states flexed their muscles. Still, the duchy maintained its course, cautious, modest, enduring. Its rise may have been modest, but its persistence prepared it for the storms to come. And so you leave Württemberg's vineyards, the taste of dry red lingering on your tongue, the sound of Lutheran hymns echoing from plain churches, the sight of a modest court trying to balance ambition and survival. In this quieter corner of Germany, you've seen how a dynasty and its people wove endurance from modest means, reminding you that not every story of monarchy is about brilliance or disaster. Sometimes it's about steady steps on narrow paths, leading to survival when others fall. The smell of Württemberg's vineyards lingers faintly, but now the air grows heavy with smoke, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of upheaval. You've walked into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a time when Europe itself feels as if it has been thrown into a cauldron and set to boil. The French Revolution has shattered the old order, and from its chaos emerges Napoleon Bonaparte, the short Corsican with a towering ambition. His armies march across the continent, scattering centuries of tradition like dry leaves. And here, in the patchwork of German states, Bavaria, Württemberg and Prussia, each feel the tremors in different ways. You find yourself on a muddy road in 1796, French troops advancing into German lands, villagers hide in their homes, soldiers plunder barns, church bells ring in alarm. The Holy Roman Empire, already a creaky skeleton of medieval structures, groans under the pressure. By the time Napoleon declares himself emperor in 1804, the empire is all but obsolete. The Germans are no longer ruled by an abstract emperor in Vienna. They are forced to choose between resistance, survival, or alliance with France. Mainstream fact. In 1806, Napoleon dissolved the Holy Roman Empire entirely. More than 1,000 years of continuity vanished with a stroke, replaced by his Confederation of the Rhine. For the German princes, this was both terrifying and liberating. The empire's clumsy bureaucracy was gone, but now they stood exposed directly under Napoleon's shadow. You watch as electors, dukes and kings scramble to secure their place in the new order, some bowing to France, others resisting with clenched fists. Prussia, proud of its army and legacy under Frederick the Great, initially hesitated. But when it finally challenged Napoleon, the result was disastrous. The twin defeats at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806 crushed Prussian pride. Imagine the shock. The kingdom once feared for its discipline humiliated in a matter of hours. Soldiers scattered, fortresses fell, and Napoleon rode into Berlin as if mocking Frederick's ghost. The humiliation cut so deep that later generations would speak of it as a scar that never healed. Meanwhile, Bavaria chose a different path. Maximilian IV. Joseph, Elector of Bavaria, saw which way the wind was blowing. In 1805 he allied with Napoleon. His gamble paid off. Napoleon rewarded him by elevating Bavaria into a kingdom. Maximilian became King Maximilian I Joseph, the first monarch of a newly crowned Bavarian kingdom. Picture the celebrations in Munich. Processions, fireworks, and the intoxicating realization that Bavaria had vaulted into kingship, thanks to French favour. For once, the Wittelsbachs weren't just dukes or electors, they wore crowns. And then Württemberg, modest little Württemberg, made its own leap. Duke Frederick II allied with Napoleon, and in 1806 he too was rewarded with kingship, becoming King Frederick I of Württemberg. Suddenly the vineyards and modest palaces were draped in royal banners, and Stuttgart had a king's court. It must have felt surreal. A duchy that had once struggled for survival now stood among monarchies. You can almost see Frederick puffing his chest, aware that he owed his crown less to divine providence than to French artillery. Here's your quirky tidbit. Frederick I of Württemberg was a giant of a man, nearly 7 feet tall and so corpulent that he could barely walk without assistance. Napoleon himself joked about his size, but still entrusted him with kingship. Guests at his court were said to marvel at his sheer physical presence, even as they whispered about his overindulgence. In an age when monarchs were judged by dignity and poise, Frederick looked more like a caricature, but power is power, no matter its shape. The Napoleonic era forced these German kingdoms to modernize. Feudal privileges were dismantled, legal codes streamlined, and administration rationalized. In Bavaria, Montgelas, the brilliant minister under Maximilian I, introduced sweeping reforms, abolishing serfdom, secularizing church lands, centralizing administration. Suddenly, peasants who had been bound to estates found themselves freer, though also more exposed to taxes and conscription. Württemberg underwent similar changes, its estates curtailed, its administration reshaped to fit Napoleon's model. These reforms didn't just vanish after Napoleon's fall, they laid the groundwork for modern statehood. Yet Napoleon's dominance came at a heavy cost. His wars drained resources, conscripted thousands of German soldiers, and turned the land into a battlefield again and again. Imagine Bavarian peasants watching their sons marched off to fight in Spain or Russia, far from home, for a cause that wasn't theirs. When the Grand Army marched into Russia in 1812, Bavarian and Württemberg contingents went with it. Most never returned. Their bodies froze along the endless snowbound roads, swallowed by a war of imperial vanity. Prussia, though humiliated, quietly rebuilt under reformers like Stein and Scharnhorst. They introduced universal education, reformed the army, and instilled a new sense of civic duty. Out of humiliation came resilience, aim. You picture classrooms filled with children learning not just obedience but patriotism, seeds planted for the nationalism that would later surge. Historians still argue whether Prussia's reforms were born of genuine enlightenment or sheer desperation after Jena. Either way, they gave the kingdom a second life. By 1813, the tide turned. Napoleon's defeat in Russia emboldened his German allies to reconsider. Bavaria switched sides, joining the coalition against France with the Treaty of Ried. Württemberg hesitated, but eventually did the same. Prussia, eager for revenge, surged back into the fight. At the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, in October 1813, Napoleon faced a coalition of Austrians, Prussians, Russians and Swedes. Over 500,000 soldiers clashed, the largest battle Europe had ever seen. Cannons roared, cavalry charged, and the air turned thick with smoke and screams. When the battle ended, Napoleon's power in Germany was broken. For the German kingdoms, the aftermath was bittersweet. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 reshaped the continent, creating the German Confederation, a loose association of states under Austrian leadership. Bavaria and Württemberg kept their new royal crowns, thanks to clever diplomacy, while Prussia emerged stronger, gaining new territories in the Rhineland and Westphalia. The Holy Roman Empire was gone forever, replaced by a new patchwork where kings who owed their thrones to Napoleon managed to keep them even after his downfall. Quirky, almost fringe detail. During the Congress of Vienna, King Frederick I of Württemberg insisted that his daughters be recognised as princesses of a royal house, not merely ducal. His stubbornness annoyed diplomats, but he got his way. Even in matters of etiquette, the Napoleonic upheaval had redrawn hierarchies. A duchy once modest now demanded royal treatment, its ruler unwilling to give up a single ounce of dignity earned by French favour. As you walk through Stuttgart, Munich and Berlin in the aftermath of these years, you sense both exhaustion and renewal. Streets are scarred by war, treasuries drained, yet the crowns remain perched on heads that would never have worn them without Napoleon's storm. The people grumble about taxes, conscription and hunger, yet they also carry a new awareness. The world has changed forever. Old feudal chains have been broken. Nationalism stirs. The idea of a united Germany begins to flicker, faint but undeniable. Historians still argue about Napoleon's legacy in German lands. Was he a tyrant who drained them of blood and treasure, or a modernizer who inadvertently cleared away medieval clutter? Perhaps both. He was a scourge and a catalyst, a destroyer and a builder. The kingdoms of Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg all bore his mark, in scars and in reforms. And so, as you leave the smoke of battlefields behind, you carry images that won't fade. Prussian soldiers humbled at Jena, Bavarian crowds cheering their new king, Württemberg's corpulent monarch demanding respect, and Napoleon himself striding across maps as though Europe were merely his chessboard. The upheaval shook monarchies to their roots, but those roots, strangely enough, grew deeper afterward, preparing them for the next century's storms. The smoke of Leipzig still hangs in your lungs as you wander forward into the 19th century, and with each step the world grows more orderly, more industrial, more national. Napoleon is gone, but his shadow lingers in the rearranged map of Europe. The crowns of Bavaria and Württemberg remain firmly on their monarchs' heads, glittering more brightly than ever before. But the real story ahead, the tension that will define the century, is the rivalry between two German powers, Austria and Prussia. Imagine two heavyweight fighters circling in the same ring, each claiming leadership over the German-speaking peoples, each unwilling to yield, and you, poor night owl, are stuck ringside, watching them trade blows in slow, thundering motion. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 created the German Confederation, a loose bundle of 39 states held together under Austrian presidency. It was less a nation than a patchwork quilt stitched with fraying thread. Austria, ancient and sprawling, claimed seniority as the old imperial heart. Prussia, leaner but sharper, eyed the future. At first glance, Austria seemed the natural leader. Its Habsburg emperors had ruled for centuries. Its capital Vienna sparkled with cultural prestige. Its armies stretched across many lands. But Prussia had an edge. Its army, hardened by humiliation and reform, its efficient bureaucracy, and its restless ambition. Mainstream fact. The rivalry between Prussia and Austria came to a head in 1866 during the Austro-Prussian War, a conflict that reshaped Germany's destiny. But long before cannons roared at Königgrätz, tensions simmered in treaties, customs unions, and political intrigue. You can almost hear the muttering of diplomats in smoky chambers, their quills scratching as they tried to balance two powers that could not share the same crown. In the early decades of the century, Austria looked confident. The German Confederation's Diet, Assembly, met in Frankfurt, presided over by Austrian representatives. Vienna acted like the elder statesman setting the tone, but while Austria basked in tradition, Prussia was quietly laying tracks, literally. The Industrial Revolution gave Prussia a massive advantage. Coal mines in the Ruhr, steel factories in Silesia, and new railways began knitting the kingdom into a modern machine. If Austria was a grand old waltz, Prussia was a snare drum rolling toward crescendo. A quirky tidbit here, in 1834 Prussia launched the Zollverein, a customs union that swept away trade barriers among most German states. Bavaria and Württemberg eventually joined, but Austria remained excluded. It may sound like dry economics, but the Zollverein was revolutionary. Merchants cheered as toll booths vanished, goods flowed faster, cheaper, freer. More importantly, it gave Prussia influence across Germany, not through conquest, but through commerce. You might laugh at the thought, sausages, beer and coal proving more powerful than muskets. Yet trade created loyalties, and loyalties created networks. Austria, stubbornly outside, began to look old-fashioned. Still, Austria had its own tools. It cultivated loyalty among conservative monarchs wary of Prussia's ambitions. It suppressed revolts, maintained Catholic solidarity, and leaned on centuries of prestige. In 1848, when revolution swept across Europe, both powers faced upheaval. Students and workers in Berlin and Vienna built barricades shouting for freedom, unity, and constitutions. You step into those streets and hear the chaos. Cobblestones pried up, muskets fired, flags of black, red, gold fluttering defiantly. For a moment it looked as if a united liberal Germany might rise. But the monarchs struck back. In Vienna, troops fired on crowds. In Berlin, King Frederick William IV of Prussia promised reforms only to retract them later. The dream of unity fractured. Historians still argue whether 1848 was a failure or a seed planted for the future. The revolutions collapsed, but they revealed something undeniable. Germans longed for unity, and someone, Austria or Prussia, would eventually deliver it. In the 1850s, Austria seemed to recover. Its armies fought in Italy. Its diplomacy remained central. Yet cracks widened. The empire was a patchwork of Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Croats, and more, all restless, all demanding recognition. Governing this multi-ethnic mosaic consumed Vienna's energy. Prussia, by contrast, was more homogeneous, focused, and free to concentrate on German affairs. You can almost picture Austria as a juggler frantically keeping a dozen balls in the air, while Prussia sharpens one very large sword. Enter Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian statesman with piercing eyes and a cigar clenched in his teeth. He became minister-president in 1862, promising to solve Germany's question not through speeches and majority decisions, but through iron and blood. You can hear his gravelly voice delivering that phrase, a warning and a prophecy rolled into one. He wasn't interested in lofty ideals, he wanted results. For him, Prussia must lead and Austria must step aside. Tension escalated over Schleswig and Holstein, two duchies caught between Denmark and Germany. In 1864, Prussia and Austria joined forces to wrest them from Danish control. The victory was quick, but the spoils turned sour. Who would administer the duchies? Austria took Holstein, Prussia took Schleswig. The arrangement was like giving two rival siblings one half of the same toy. You know a fight is coming. And indeed, Bismarck was counting on it. Here's your quirky tidbit. Bismarck once entertained visiting diplomats in his Berlin residence by serving endless plates of sausage and beer, insisting this was the true German way. The diplomats, used to French cuisine, were bewildered, but Bismarck relished the symbolism. He wanted to project Prussia as hearty, plain-spoken, unpretentious, and destined to lead Germany away from decadent Vienna and Paris. Even dinner in his hands became propaganda. In 1866, the quarrel over Schleswig-Holstein erupted into full war, Austria with its allies expected to dominate. But Prussia had prepared. Its army, reorganised under General Helmuth von Moltke, wielded the needle gun, a breech-loading rifle that fired faster than Austrian muskets. Its railways allowed rapid troop movements. When battle came at Königgrätz, also called Sadowa, Prussia's efficiency shone. Artillery thundered, infantry advanced in coordinated lines, and Austria crumbled. In one decisive clash, centuries of Habsburg dominance in German affairs were broken. Imagine the shock. For generations, Austria had been the senior partner. Now it lay humbled, excluded from German politics. Bismarck, shrewd even in victory, chose not to crush Austria entirely. He knew Germany would need Austrian friendship later. Instead, he created the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership, leaving Austria out. The German world was divided, but the direction was clear. Prussia was in charge. Historians still argue whether Austria's decline was inevitable or accelerated by Bismarck's genius. Could Vienna have modernized faster, embraced the Zollverein, or curbed its multi-ethnic distractions? Or was Prussia's rise unstoppable once it combined industrial might with military reform? The debate continues, like two ghosts still arguing over who was destined to rule. For Bavaria and Württemberg, the rivalry was a nightmare. Both were Catholic, both wary of Protestant Prussia, and both fearful of losing independence. In 1866, they sided with Austria. Their armies marched against Prussia, only to be defeated alongside their ally. After the war, they were forced to sign treaties with Prussia, joining its sphere of influence. Imagine the bitterness in Munich and Stuttgart. Proud kings realizing they could no longer act freely, their fate tethered to Berlin's will. And yet, the rivalry was not just about muskets and treaties. It was about identity. Was Germany to be a greater Germany, including Austria and its patchwork empire, or a lesser Germany under Prussian leadership alone? Bismarck's victory made the answer clear. It would be the latter. Austria turned southward, focusing on its empire in Hungary and the Balkans. Prussia turned north and west, laying rails toward unification. You leave Königgrätz with the sound of gunfire still echoing in your ears, but the larger echo is louder, the echo of shifting power. Prussia has bested Austria. The German world tilts decisively toward Berlin. Bavaria and Württemberg sulk but cannot resist. The stage is set for the next act. The forging of a German empire, not in Vienna's salons but in the iron workshops and battlefields of Prussia. The cannon smoke of Königgrätz dissolves, and as you step further south, the air sweetens again. Instead of the clatter of rifles and the growl of Bismarck's speeches, you're welcomed by the smell of roasted almonds, the strains of violins, and the clinking of beer mugs. You've returned to Bavaria, but this is not the glittering court of Maximilian I Joseph, nor the lonely castles of Ludwig II. This is the land of festivals, of painted villages, of rustic pride woven into folklore. Bavaria in the 19th century leans into something new: romance. Not the kind with roses and love letters, but the romanticism of identity, culture, and belonging. Walk into Munich's Theresienwiese on a crisp October morning in 1810, and you'll find yourself swept up in a celebration. Crown Prince Ludwig, later King Ludwig I, has just married Princess Therese of Saxe-Hildburghausen, and to mark the union, a great festival is proclaimed. Horse races thunder across the meadow, beer flows freely, and villagers pour in from all corners. That festival becomes annual tradition, growing each year into what we know today as Oktoberfest. Mainstream fact, it is still celebrated more than 2 centuries later, drawing millions. At its core, Oktoberfest was more than just merrymaking. It was a deliberate cultivation of Bavarian identity. What better way to bind people to monarchy than through a festival where everyone eats, drinks and cheers together? Bavaria embraced romantic nationalism not through armies, but through culture. As the century unfolded, folk costumes became symbols of pride. The men wore lederhosen, the women dirndls, garments that turned everyday clothing into timeless markers of belonging. You wander through a mountain village during a Kirchweih festival, and the square bursts with colour. Embroidered aprons, feathered hats, silver clasps gleaming in sunlight. It isn't just quaint tradition, it's politics. The Wittelsbach kings encouraged such displays, fostering a sense that Bavaria was distinct, Catholic, and proud, even within a Prussia-dominated Germany. Here's a quirky tidbit. King Ludwig I, who reigned from 1825 to 1848, adored beauty so much that he created a gallery of beauties in Nymphenburg Palace. He commissioned portraits of 36 women he considered the most beautiful in Munich, ranging from noble ladies to shoemakers' daughters. Today you can still walk the gallery, gaze at these portraits, and imagine Ludwig strolling there, sighing dramatically. Historians still argue whether this was harmless appreciation of beauty or an indulgent monarch's eccentricity. Either way, it speaks volumes about Bavaria's blending of courtly culture with romantic flourish. Ludwig I also transformed Munich into what he called an Athens on the Isar. He commissioned neoclassical architecture, grand boulevards, museums, and art galleries. The Glyptothek, the Alte Pinakothek, and the Ludwigstrasse all rose under his patronage. As you stroll these streets, you feel the pull of antiquity. Columns, statues, wide avenues designed to elevate citizens and impress visitors. Bavaria might have been politically weaker than Prussia, but in art and architecture it sought to rival the great capitals of Europe. Yet Ludwig I's reign was not all romance and beauty. In 1848, revolutionary fervour erupted across Europe, and Munich was not spared. Crowds demanded liberal reforms, freedom of the press, and greater rights. Ludwig I, already unpopular for his scandalous affair with the Irish dancer Lola Montez, became the target of anger. Lola, flamboyant and headstrong, wielded influence at court, sparking outrage among ministers and citizens alike. Eventually, Ludwig abdicated in favour of his son, Maximilian II, a monarch less flamboyant and more cautious. The Gallery of Beauties may have outlasted him, but his rule ended in scandal. Still, Ludwig I's cultural legacy endured. By mid-century, Bavaria had cemented its identity, not through battlefields but through art, music and folklore, and Maximilian II continued to foster intellectual life, inviting scholars, scientists and writers to Munich. Under his reign, the city became a hub of romantic and early modern thought, attracting figures like Richard Wagner, before Ludwig II later took him under his extravagant wing. The countryside too became infused with romantic imagery. Painters of the Munich school captured alpine landscapes bathed in golden light, shepherds tending flocks under dramatic skies, villages nestled against looming mountains. This wasn't just art, it was a vision of Bavaria as eternal, idyllic, and rooted in nature. You can almost hear the babbling brooks and smell the pine forests as you gaze at their canvases. Religion remained central. Bavaria, staunchly Catholic, leaned heavily into Marian devotion. Pilgrimage churches, often in Rococo splendour, filled the landscape. Wieskirche, with its delicate stucco work and soft colours, became a sight of wonder. Pilgrims trudged across muddy fields to kneel before miraculous statues, their faith interwoven with folk traditions. Festivals blended sacred and secular. Corpus Christi processions carried the Eucharist through streets where beer tents waited nearby. The line between devotion and celebration blurred until both felt like parts of the same rhythm. Historians still argue whether this Bavarian romanticism was authentic or carefully manufactured by the monarchy. Was Oktoberfest a spontaneous outpouring of joy or a calculated tool of statecraft? Were folk costumes preserved because villagers clung to them, or because kings and intellectuals romanticised them? The answer is likely both. Identity often grows from the interplay of genuine tradition and deliberate invention, and in Bavaria, both worked hand in hand to create a culture distinct enough to resist complete absorption into Prussia's shadow. One of the stranger details of this era lies in Ludwig II's continuation of the Romantic ideal. His castles, though eccentric, built on the groundwork of his grandfather's cultural nationalism. Neuschwanstein was not just Ludwig's personal fantasy. It also became a monument to the romantic Bavarian identity his dynasty had been fostering for decades. When tourists today sip beer at Oktoberfest, while wearing lederhosen, and then snap photos of Neuschwanstein, they unknowingly participate in a project centuries in the making. Meanwhile, Bavaria's resistance to Prussian dominance simmered beneath the surface. Its kings, though technically loyal to the German Confederation and later the Empire, maintained strong emphasis on their separate traditions. The cultivation of a romantic Bavaria wasn't just cultural nostalgia, it was subtle political resistance. If Prussia embodied iron discipline, Bavaria embodied joy, faith and art. And if Germans had to be united under Berlin's command, Bavaria at least demanded to keep its soul. Quirky fringe-like note. In the 19th century, Bavarian folklorists eagerly collected peasant tales, superstitions and songs, preserving them as cultural treasures. Some tales involved witches who lived in alpine caves, spectral huntsmen who chased travellers, and spirits who haunted mountain passes. The same state that produced Rococo churches also proudly published ghost stories. You picture a scholar by candlelight, carefully writing down a shepherd's tale of phantom bells ringing in a snowstorm, convinced this preserved the essence of Bavarian identity. As the century rolled toward its climax, Bavaria stood apart in character if not in sovereignty. Its monarchs wore crowns granted by Napoleon, but its people carried a culture that felt older, richer, and stubbornly unique. Walking through Munich on a festival day, you hear brass bands strike up, smell sausages grilling, see children in miniature lederhosen, and watch priests lead processions. The mix is noisy, colourful, and unapologetically Bavarian. So while Prussia and Austria traded blows and decided Germany's fate with iron and blood, Bavaria nurtured another kind of power, the romance of belonging. Its Oktoberfest, its folk costumes, its churches and festivals all became shields against the homogenizing pull of empire. In the candlelit halls of Munich and the crowded taverns of Alpine villages, Bavaria remained itself, reminding you that culture can be as enduring a fortress as any castle wall. The laughter of Oktoberfest drifts away, and you find yourself once again on the quieter roads of Württemberg. Compared to Munich's roaring brass bands and Prussia's thundering cannons, the atmosphere here feels measured, cautious, and deliberate. Vineyards stretch across rolling hills, towns hum with guilds and parliaments, and Stuttgart, though modest, buzzes with the chatter of lawyers, clerks, and politicians. This is not a land of fairy tale castles or triumphant battlefields. It is a land of constitutions, assemblies, and compromise. Württemberg, small though it may have been, became a laboratory for constitutional monarchy in the German world. When Württemberg emerged from the Napoleonic storm as a kingdom in 1806, its people were sceptical. Duke Frederick II, suddenly King Frederick I thanks to Napoleon's gift, had ruled with an iron hand. He curtailed the traditional estates, centralised power, and pursued reforms that felt more like decrees. But after Napoleon's fall, pressure mounted for constitutional limits. People wanted representation, rights, and protection against arbitrary rule. Even in sleepy Stuttgart, the winds of liberalism whistled through the streets. Mainstream fact. In 1819, Württemberg adopted one of the first constitutions in Germany, establishing a parliament, the Landtag, that had real influence over taxation and legislation. While not fully democratic, it gave citizens a stronger voice than in many neighbouring states. For a small kingdom, this was a major step, and it earned Württemberg a reputation as unusually constitutional in a Europe where monarchs often preferred absolute authority. Picture the scene. In Stuttgart's Neues Schloss, chandeliers glow as King William I, who succeeded Frederick I in 1816, reluctantly signs the constitution. Outside, citizens gather, murmuring approval, sensing they have won something rare. Inside the chamber of the new parliament, representatives take their seats, nobles in fine coats, clergy in robes, burghers with pens poised. They argue over taxes, budgets, and reforms. The debates are long, tedious at times, but the very act of debate marks progress. Württemberg becomes a place where kings must listen, at least occasionally, to their subjects. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Württemberg Parliament developed a reputation for being slow, meticulous, and overly fond of procedure. Visitors joked that debates about something as simple as road maintenance could stretch for days. Imagine rows of delegates droning on about gravel and tolls while citizens outside roll their eyes. Yet that plodding pace reflected something deeper, a commitment to law over whim, process over decree. In its dullness lay its strength. The balance between monarch and parliament was never smooth. King William I himself embodied the contradictions. He introduced progressive agricultural reforms, promoted education, and supported infrastructure projects. But he also resented constraints on his power, clashing frequently with the Landtag. At one point, when finances grew dire, he tried to bypass Parliament altogether, only to be forced back into negotiation. Württemberg's politics became a dance. One step forward for the king, one step back for the Parliament, neither able to dominate fully. Religion added another layer of complexity. Württemberg was staunchly Protestant, and its constitutional culture reflected a certain Lutheran seriousness. Sermons and politics often overlapped, with pastors urging moral responsibility in governance. Yet Catholic minorities lived within the kingdom, and their rights became recurring points of debate. Historians still argue whether Württemberg's constitution was genuinely inclusive or subtly biased toward its Protestant majority. The fact that such questions were even debated, however, set it apart from states where monarchs simply imposed their will. Meanwhile, society itself was changing. The Industrial Revolution crept into Württemberg, though more slowly than in Prussia's Ruhr. Textile mills, machine workshops and railways appeared, transforming Stuttgart and other towns. New social classes, industrialists, factory workers, emerged, pressing the constitutional system to adapt. You can almost hear the grumble of a factory owner demanding fewer trade restrictions, while, across the chamber, a rural delegate insists that vineyards must be protected. The parliament, sluggish though it was, became the place where these tensions played out. One quirky Württemberg detail: the kingdom was proud of its education system. By the 19th century it boasted high literacy rates, and its teachers were famously strict. There's a joke from the era that if you met a Swabian child, he'd correct your grammar before saying hello. This emphasis on schooling meant that when constitutional debates took place, citizens actually followed them closely. Imagine taverns buzzing with talk not just of crops and taxes, but of legal articles and parliamentary votes. The revolutions of 1848 rattled Württemberg just as they did the rest of Germany. Crowds filled Stuttgart streets, waving black, red, gold flags, demanding greater democracy and unity. For a moment, it seemed Württemberg might leap into radical reform. Delegates from across the German states even gathered in Frankfurt to draft a constitution for a united Germany. Württemberg sent representatives, and citizens followed the debates eagerly. But like elsewhere, the movement faltered. Monarchs regained control, and hopes of unity under liberal ideals collapsed. In Württemberg, the king granted small concessions but reasserted his authority, reminding everyone that constitutions were still fragile. Historians still argue whether Württemberg's constitutionalism was a model for Germany or merely a provincial curiosity. Compared to Britain's parliament, it was limited. Compared to Prussia's rigid monarchy, it was progressive. Perhaps its greatest achievement was showing that compromise, however frustrating, could stabilise a small state caught between giants. While Bavaria flaunted its Catholic festivals and Prussia flexed military muscle, Württemberg quietly muddled through, balancing monarch, parliament, and people. By the later 19th century, Württemberg's constitutional monarchy had become part of its identity. Citizens prided themselves on their Landtag, however tedious. The kings learned to work within its limits, even if grudgingly. And when the German Empire formed in 1871, Württemberg entered with its constitutional traditions intact. Unlike Prussia, where the king-emperor wielded immense power, Württemberg's citizens still enjoyed a sense that their voices mattered, however faintly. Quirky, almost fringe note, Württemberg's parliament was known for occasionally holding sessions in dialect, with representatives slipping into Swabian rather than formal High German. Outsiders found it rustic, even laughable, but locals saw it as authentic. Imagine debates where official transcripts had to pause because the clerk couldn't quite capture a delegate's village inflections. It may not have impressed Berlin, but it made the Landtag feel rooted in local soil. So as you step out of Stuttgart's assembly hall, the scent of ink and candle wax lingering, you realise Württemberg's modest rise was not just about crowns and treaties. It was about building a political culture where law mattered, where negotiation replaced decree, and where even a small kingdom could teach larger ones a lesson in endurance. The process was slow, sometimes maddening, but it kept Württemberg stable in a century when crowns toppled like dominoes. You glance back at the chamber one last time. The benches are empty now, the voices stilled, but you can almost hear the echoes of debates about taxes, roads, schools and rights. No fireworks, no battles, just words, patient and stubborn, carving out a path. Württemberg's story may lack the glamour of Bavaria or the drama of Prussia, but in its steady constitutionalism it offers something rare, a glimpse of monarchy that learned, however imperfectly, to share its stage. The wooden benches of Stuttgart's Landtag fade behind you, and the quiet hum of constitutional debate gives way to something louder, sharper, more relentless. The air is thicker now, filled with coal smoke and the clang of hammers. You've stepped into 19th century Prussia at full throttle, and everywhere you look, machines are rising, railways are spreading, and factories are belching plumes into the sky. If earlier centuries gave Prussia its iron discipline, this one gives it literal iron, coal, steel, locomotives, and cannons. The kingdom that once drilled soldiers in silent fields now roars with the engines of the Industrial Revolution. You walk through the Ruhr Valley, and the ground itself trembles beneath your boots. This region, once scattered with villages and pastures, has become a forest of chimneys and smokestacks. Mines plunge deep into the earth, workers clambering down shafts with lamps swinging from their helmets. The air smells of soot and sweat, and the constant hiss of steam engines drowns out birdsong. This is Prussia's new heart, pumping wealth, power and weapons into the bloodstream of the state. Mainstream fact: by the mid-19th century, Prussia had become one of Europe's leading industrial powers. Its rail network stretched thousands of kilometres, binding together provinces from the Rhineland to East Prussia. Coal production soared, ironworks churned, and Krupp's factories in Essen turned out cannons that would make Prussia's armies feared across the continent. The very name Krupp became synonymous with steel and power. When foreign generals spoke of the Prussian military, they increasingly meant not just its discipline but its technology. But factories were not built without cost. You wander into a workers' tenement in Essen, and the air is stifling. Families crowd into single rooms, children sleep 3 to a bed, and water trickles from a pump shared by dozens. Outside, the streets are caked with soot, and laundry hung between windows turns grey in a single afternoon. Historians still argue whether Prussia's industrial miracle lifted the masses or exploited them mercilessly. Wages rose slowly, but conditions were harsh. Child labour was common, accidents frequent, and unions suppressed. Yet even in misery, the workers formed the raw material of a new society, one that would demand a voice in politics. Here's your quirky tidbit. When railways spread across Prussia, people were both awed and terrified. Some believed travelling at 30 kilometres per hour could suffocate passengers, or that cows grazing near tracks would stop giving milk. Newspapers printed anxious editorials about railway madness, while others celebrated the trains as symbols of modernity. You can almost chuckle at the thought of Prussian villagers clutching their hats as the first locomotives thunder past, while bureaucrats quietly calculate how fast troops could now be moved to a border. And indeed, the military never strayed far from industrialisation. Railways weren't just for merchants and travellers, they were strategic arteries. Prussian generals planned timetables with the same precision as battle formations, ensuring entire regiments could be deployed in days rather than weeks. The fusion of industrial power and military discipline gave Prussia an edge that Austria, with its slower modernisation, struggled to match. The needle gun at Königgrätz was only the beginning. Now Prussia dreamed of entire wars won by rail and steel. Berlin, the capital, transformed as well. Once mocked as a provincial garrison town, it swelled into a modern metropolis. Broad boulevards filled with horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps lit the streets, and department stores lured customers with glittering displays. Banks, newspapers, and universities flourished, creating a hub of finance and culture. You stroll into Den Linden, past the Brandenburg Gate, and hear the clatter of hoofbeats mingling with the whistle of steam engines from nearby stations. The city hums with ambition, restless and impatient like a young man tapping his foot before a duel. Prussia's rulers understood the importance of industry. King Frederick William IV, though personally more romantic and artistic than practical, allowed economic reforms that encouraged growth. Later, under William I and his minister Bismarck, industrialisation became inseparable from state policy. Tariffs protected domestic industry, treaties expanded trade, and the Zollverein Customs Union pulled other German states into Prussia's economic orbit. Bavaria and Württemberg grumbled but joined. Austria, excluded, sulked on the sidelines. Every ton of coal, every shipment of steel, bound Germany closer to Berlin. Historians still debate whether Prussia's industrial surge was inevitable given its resources, or whether it required the guiding hand of its rulers. Was it geography, coal and iron conveniently side by side in the Ruhr, or was it governance, efficient bureaucracy, investment in rail, and clever tariffs? Perhaps it was both. What is certain is that Prussia seized its moment, turning black rock into golden power. In the countryside, however, the old Junker aristocracy still reigned. Their estates in East Elbia remained feudal in character, serfs only recently emancipated, peasants still deferential. This duality defined Prussia. Ultra-modern industry in the west, semi-feudal estates in the east. A Berlin banker might wear the latest fashions from Paris, while an East Prussian landlord still cracked whips over peasants. The state thrived on both, balancing the coal baron and the Junker officer in the same parliament. Quirky note, Prussia was so determined to keep industry disciplined that factory inspectors sometimes enforced not just safety, but morality. Workers were fined for swearing, drinking on the job, or even humming songs deemed unproductive. Imagine a foreman glaring at a labourer for whistling a tune, pencil poised to deduct from his pay. Industrial efficiency became a kind of secular religion, replacing prayers with timetables. And yet, even amid smokestacks and railways, culture bloomed. Universities like Berlin became centres of philosophy and science, nurturing giants like Hegel, Humboldt and later Marx, though Marx himself was more revolutionary than Prussian. Scientists advanced chemistry, physics and engineering, feeding industry's appetite for innovation. Prussia wasn't just producing steel, it was producing ideas, some of which would shake the world. By the 1860s, when Bismarck steered Prussia into conflicts with Denmark, Austria and finally France, he relied heavily on the fruits of industry. Troops moved by rail, armed with advanced weapons, supplied by efficient factories. Wars that once dragged on for years now ended in weeks, the tempo quickened by steam and steel. You watch soldiers boarding trains, waving hats as whistles blow, and realise you're witnessing a revolution not just in technology, but in the very nature of war. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Traditionalists lamented the loss of old rhythms, crafts displaced by machines, villages swallowed by factories, landscapes blackened. Poets wrote mournful verses about rivers choked with smoke. Farmers complained about rising bread prices as grain markets globalised. But progress was relentless. You can almost feel the ground shudder beneath your feet as locomotives thunder past, carrying coal one way, troops the other, tying the fate of millions to the rails. Historians still argue whether Prussia's industrial surge made unification inevitable. Some claim economic unity through the Zollverein paved the road more securely than any battlefield. Others insist Bismarck's diplomacy and wars were decisive. Either way, the industrial boom gave Prussia the muscle it needed to dominate. Without coal, steel and rails, iron and blood might have rung hollow. As you leave the Ruhr's smokestacks behind, the night sky glows faintly orange with reflected fire, like a permanent sunset. The clang of hammers still rings in your ears, and the smell of coal clings to your coat. You know this surge is more than economics. It is destiny, reshaping not just Prussia, but all of Germany. And in that fiery glow you sense the shadow of empire forming, cast long before the crown is placed at Versailles. The glow of the Ruhr's furnaces still flickers in your imagination as you head south once more. The noise of Prussian hammers fades, replaced by the sound of alpine streams, church bells and brass bands rehearsing in village squares. Yet beneath the rustic warmth of Bavaria in the later 19th century lies something sharper, more stubborn: resistance. Bavaria has entered the German Empire after 1871, but it does so reluctantly, with its Catholic heart and cultural pride bristling under Berlin's Protestant and Prussian-dominated rule. If Prussia is the empire's engine, Bavaria is its conscience, forever muttering, "We are not Berlin." You arrive in Munich shortly after German unification. The city bustles with students, clerks, soldiers, and pilgrims, but the mood is uneasy. The Bavarian king, Ludwig II, the dreamer who built castles and drowned in mystery, was pressured into signing treaties that brought Bavaria into the new empire. But Bavaria kept special privileges, control over its own army in peacetime, its own postal service, even its own railways. Mainstream fact: Bavaria negotiated these reserved rights, Reservetrechte, in 1871, making it the only state in the empire besides Württemberg to retain such autonomy. This wasn't a gift, it was a sign of Bavarian resistance to being swallowed whole. Imagine the Bavarian parliament debating these treaties. Conservatives thump their canes, furious that Bavaria should kneel to Prussia. Liberals argue that unity is progress, that the empire offers strength. Priests warn against Protestant dominance, their sermons reminding congregations that Bavaria's Catholic soul must not be diluted. Outside, taverns rumble with debate. Half the steins raised in cheers for Germany, the other half slammed in protest against Berlin. Here's your quirky tidbit. Bavarian soldiers, even after unification, wore uniforms distinct from Prussia's. Their blue coats and light-coloured trousers stood out against Prussia's dark, spiked-helmeted troops. During parades in Berlin, Bavarian regiments often looked like guests at someone else's wedding, tolerated but never fully embraced. Officers insisted on Bavarian drill commands, stubbornly maintaining identity even under the Kaiser's watchful eye. King Ludwig II, though personally withdrawn, symbolised this unease. He resented the loss of sovereignty so much that he avoided Berlin almost entirely. He signed the Kaiser's documents but stayed in his castles, sulking with Wagner's music rather than mingling with Prussian generals. Historians still argue whether Ludwig's eccentricity was mere madness or a subtle form of protest, a refusal to legitimise Berlin's dominance by presence. Either way, his distance became symbolic. Bavaria belonged to the empire in law, but not fully in spirit. Meanwhile, Bavaria doubled down on its culture. Festivals like Oktoberfest swelled in size and pride, reinforcing local identity. Folk costumes were celebrated, folk tales collected, dialects defended. You wander into a Munich beer hall and hear loud songs in Bavarian dialect, toasting kings long gone and saints eternal. The mood is joyous, but under the foam bubble's defiance. We may be Germans, but first we are Bavarians. Religion sharpened the divide. The Kulturkampf, the culture struggle launched by Bismarck in the 1870s against Catholic influence, hit Bavaria like a thunderclap. Prussia's Protestant elite saw the Catholic Church as an obstacle to modern state building. Laws expelled Jesuits, restricted church appointments, and curbed papal authority. In Berlin, these measures seemed progressive. In Bavaria, they felt like an assault on the very soul of society. Parish priests thundered from pulpits, peasants marched in protests, and the Catholic Centre Party rose in strength, giving Bavarians a national voice of resistance within the Reichstag. Quirky note, some Bavarian villages refused to take down statues of the Virgin Mary during the Kulturkampf, even when threatened with fines. Instead, they draped them in black cloth as mourning. Imagine walking past a field shrine, Mary hidden beneath black fabric, villagers kneeling defiantly, muttering prayers while officials look on helplessly. These small gestures became acts of rebellion. The Bavarian monarchy itself walked a tightrope. After Ludwig II's death in 1886, his brother Otto was declared insane, leaving Prince Regent Luitpold to govern. Luitpold, practical and steady, enjoyed popularity by balancing Bavarian traditions with cautious cooperation in the empire. He promoted the arts, encouraged modernization, but resisted Prussian overreach. Under his regency, Munich blossomed culturally. Theatres, museums and cafes flourished. Yet loyalty to Berlin remained tepid at best. When Kaiser Wilhelm II visited, crowds cheered politely, but reserved their real affection for their own regent. Historians still argue whether Bavarian resistance was genuine defiance or simply cultural pride wrapped in politics. Did Bavaria ever truly intend to break from the empire, or was it content to grumble while enjoying the benefits of unity, railways, markets, and protection under the German flag? Perhaps both. Bavarians often joked that they joined Germany for convenience, not conviction, like guests overstaying at a party but refusing to dance to the host's music. Industry crept into Bavaria too, though slower than in Prussia. Munich developed factories, Nuremberg became a hub of toy-making and engineering, and Augsburg thrived with textiles. But even as smokestacks rose, Bavaria clung to its image as rustic and romantic. Painters in the late 19th century glorified alpine scenes, shepherds and peasant dances, projecting a vision of Bavaria as timeless. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was resistance to Berlin's grey modernity. Quirky fringe tidbit. In the 1890s, Munich became infamous as a hotbed of bohemian culture. Artists, writers and free thinkers gathered in Schwabing's cafes, mocking both Berlin's stiffness and Bavaria's own conservative traditions. They staged wild cabarets, painted scandalous canvases, and published satirical journals. Ironically, Bavaria's defiance of Berlin also created space for avant-garde rebellion at home. While Prussia drilled soldiers, Munich painted nudes. Both, in their way, were acts of resistance. By the early 20th century, Bavaria's tension with Berlin deepened. The rise of nationalism across Germany pulled at Bavarian identity. Some embraced the empire wholeheartedly, especially urban elites who benefited from trade and power. Others doubled down on Bavarian uniqueness, rallying behind Catholic politics and local traditions. Beer halls once again filled with arguments: was Bavaria German first or Bavarian forever? The answer was never simple. Bavaria remained within the empire, but always with conditions, always with grumbling, always with a lingering sense of apartness. The Wittelsbach monarchy leaned on culture and Catholicism to maintain identity, even as Prussia's iron shadow loomed. You leave Munich at twilight, brass bands still playing, steins still clinking, statues of saints glowing in candlelight. The city pulses with life, but the refrain is clear. Berlin may lead Germany, but it does not own Bavaria. The brass bands of Munich fade into silence, and the night air grows cooler as you cross into Württemberg again. Here the streets are quieter, the hills less dramatic than Bavaria's Alps, the court less dazzling than Berlin's avenues. Yet in this modest kingdom, something remarkable unfolds, a balancing act. Württemberg may not boast the pomp of Bavaria or the iron fist of Prussia, but it survives, endures, and even thrives, by carefully negotiating its place inside the German Empire. You can almost picture Württemberg as the cautious guest at a dinner table, nodding politely to both Prussia and Bavaria, careful never to spill the wine. When the German Empire was proclaimed in 1871 in Versailles' Hall of Mirrors, Württemberg entered as a full kingdom, but it did so reluctantly. King Charles I of Württemberg had little choice. Prussia had crushed Austria and France, and resistance was futile. Still, Württemberg secured special rights, its own postal service, army in peacetime, and autonomy in certain internal matters. Mainstream fact: alongside Bavaria, Württemberg was one of only 2 states in the empire with such privileges. These reserved rights allowed it to maintain some dignity, even as Berlin tightened its grip. Imagine Stuttgart's parliament chamber in the 1870s. The deputies sit in stiff rows, papers shuffled, debates dragging late into the evening. Some argue that Württemberg must cooperate fully with the new empire to benefit from its markets and protection. Others bristle, insisting that too much loyalty to Berlin will erase Württemberg's character. Outside the chamber, taverns buzz with similar arguments, farmers muttering about Prussian taxes, factory workers praising the new rail links. In Württemberg, unity always comes with hesitation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Württemberg's army retained its own uniform even after joining the empire. Its soldiers wore blue tunics and silver buttons distinct from Prussia's spiked helmets and dark coats. When marching in imperial parades, Württemberg regiments looked like cousins at a family reunion, similar enough to belong, but clearly marked as different. Officers were fiercely protective of this distinction, as if fabric itself were a statement of sovereignty. The monarchy in Württemberg played its part carefully. King Charles I, who reigned until 1891, was a reserved man, known more for his personal life than political brilliance. He married Grand Duchess Olga of Russia, and their court life was quieter than Munich's extravagance or Berlin's discipline. Stuttgart under Charles felt genteel: concerts, theatres and salons, but rarely the fireworks of scandal or revolution. Perhaps that was the point. Württemberg balanced by avoiding extremes. Yet politics here was never dull. The kingdom had a tradition of constitutionalism, and its Landtag wielded real influence. Citizens were used to representation, and political parties grew strong. The Catholic Centre Party, Liberals and later Social Democrats, all found footholds. Stuttgart became a hub for political debate, sometimes more progressive than Berlin itself. Historians still argue whether Württemberg's political culture was genuinely liberal or simply pragmatic, a way to keep the monarchy afloat by letting off steam through parliament. Either way, the result was stability. Industry crept into Württemberg's valleys, though less ferociously than in Prussia's Ruhr. Textile mills in Reutlingen, machine factories in Esslingen and engineering works in Stuttgart began to hum. Railways stitched towns together, carrying goods and ideas. But unlike Prussia's smoky urban centres, Württemberg's industrialisation remained balanced with agriculture. Vineyards still spread across hillsides, farmers still dominated much of the landscape. The kingdom became a blend, half rural tradition, half cautious modernity. Quirky note: Württemberg developed a reputation for precision engineering, particularly in tools and small machinery. While Prussia built massive steelworks and cannons, Württemberg produced fine instruments, clever devices, and meticulous craftsmanship. You can almost picture a Swabian tinkerer hunched over a workbench, perfecting a gear mechanism that would later power industrial machines across Europe. It wasn't grand, but it was practical. A kind of mechanical modesty. Religion shaped Württemberg's balancing act too. Predominantly Protestant, it contrasted sharply with Catholic Bavaria, but also avoided the Kulturkampf's harshest conflicts. The Lutheran Church remained influential, but without the bitter clashes seen elsewhere. At the same time, Württemberg tolerated Catholic minorities with less hostility than Berlin's policies often allowed. That moderation became part of its identity. A land of Protestant seriousness, yes, but also of relative coexistence. Social life reflected the balance as well. Stuttgart lacked Munich's carnival-like festivals or Berlin's swagger, but it offered a quieter culture, operas, botanical gardens, libraries. Citizens prided themselves on education and thrift. Outsiders sometimes mocked Swabians for being overly practical, even stingy. But this frugality was precisely what allowed Württemberg to keep its books balanced and its society stable. Imagine neighbours gossiping about who watered their wine too much, or who spent too much on a festival costume. Every coin mattered. Historians still argue whether Württemberg truly benefited from the empire or simply endured it. On the one hand, access to German markets, protection under Prussia's army, and participation in imperial politics gave Württemberg opportunities it could never have had alone. On the other hand, many citizens felt overshadowed, their voice drowned in Berlin's dominance. The Landtag sometimes passed motions with thinly veiled complaints about centralisation, while newspapers in Stuttgart published biting caricatures of Prussian arrogance. Resistance wasn't loud, but it simmered. As the 19th century waned, Württemberg became unexpectedly important in the world of ideas. Stuttgart hosted socialist congresses, and the Social Democratic Party found fertile ground among industrial workers. In 1907, an international socialist congress convened there, drawing radicals from across Europe. Imagine fiery speeches echoing in a city better known for its vineyards, proof that Württemberg's balancing act included making space for voices Berlin preferred to silence. Quirky fringe tidbit. Württemberg was one of the few German states to experiment with women's education early on. By the late 19th century, schools in Stuttgart cautiously opened doors to female students, sparking both excitement and scandal. Critics muttered that teaching women mathematics would doom family life. Advocates argued it was progress. It was another balancing act, tradition tugging one way, reform tugging the other, with Württemberg wobbling between. By the dawn of the 20th century, Württemberg had settled into its role, neither powerhouse nor pawn, but steady participant. Its kings wore crowns, but its parliament kept them in check. Its industries grew, but its vineyards endured. Its citizens grumbled about Berlin, but enjoyed the empire's benefits. When war drums began to beat in 1914, Württemberg was as much a part of Germany as Prussia or Bavaria, yet still proudly itself, still cautious, still balanced. You leave Stuttgart at dusk, the scent of wine drifting from nearby taverns, the spires of Protestant churches outlined against the sky. Behind you the Parliament's lamps still glow, clerks still scribble minutes, debates still drag on. Ahead the empire rumbles restlessly toward the 20th century. Württemberg may not lead, may not dazzle, but it remains upright on the tightrope, a kingdom defined not by spectacle but by balance. The quiet order of Württemberg's parliament flickers out behind you, and now the air thickens again, this time not with soot or incense but with anticipation. You're standing in the mid-19th century, when the word Deutschland is no longer just a poet's dream or a vague cultural notion. It is becoming a political reality. Yet the path toward German unification is jagged, contested, and charged with tension. Every monarch in Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg feels the pressure, how to preserve their own crowns while yielding to the pull of a larger nation. You sense the unease first in Frankfurt, where the German Confederation's assembly meets. Delegates drone on in endless debates, filling smoky halls with speeches about sovereignty, trade and national destiny. But their efforts feel powerless compared to the realities unfolding outside. Railways binding cities together, factories producing common goods, newspapers spreading shared language and outrage. You glance at a copy of the Allgemeine Zeitung, and realised that ordinary Germans now read about the same events from Hamburg to Munich. Ideas are travelling faster than the old structures can contain them. Mainstream fact: in 1848, revolution erupted across Europe, and in the German states it took the form of demands for a united, liberal Germany. Students, workers, and middle-class reformers gathered in Frankfurt's Paulskirche, where the first freely elected German parliament assembled. They drafted a constitution for a united Germany, with a constitutional monarchy at its head. The crown was even offered to the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, but he rejected it, dismissing it as a crown from the gutter since it came from revolutionaries, not other monarchs. That refusal was pivotal. The dream of unity through liberal ideals collapsed, leaving Germans disappointed and their monarchs relieved. The aftermath of 1848 weighed heavily. In Bavaria, King Maximilian II cautiously embraced some reforms, but remained wary of radicalism. He encouraged intellectual life in Munich, creating a cultural flourishing, but he also tightened reins whenever republican ideas flared. In Württemberg, the constitutional tradition made space for debate, but the monarchy kept firm control. In Prussia, the king granted a constitution, but it was carefully written to preserve royal dominance. Historians still argue whether 1848 was a tragic failure or a necessary rehearsal, planting seeds that would only bloom decades later. Quirky tidbit: the Frankfurt Parliament debated for days over the precise shape of Germany on a map. Should Austria be included, Grossdeutschland, or excluded, Kleindeutschland? Delegates drew borders with obsessive detail, even discussing tiny islands. Imagine a group of exhausted men, ink-stained and quarrelsome, hunched over maps late into the night, arguing whether Tyrol belonged in their dream. In the end, the question was unresolved, but the Prussian victory of 1866 would later answer it decisively. Austria would be excluded. While idealists debated, Bismarck sharpened his tools. Appointed Prussian minister-president in 1862, he manoeuvred between liberals and conservatives with equal cunning. His famous declaration about iron and blood was less a threat than a prophecy. German unity would not come from speeches, but from wars, and he proved it in 3 calculated steps: Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and France in 1870. Each war tightened the noose around the idea of unification, bringing it closer to reality. The war with Denmark over Schleswig and Holstein seemed small, but it was the spark. Prussia and Austria cooperated to seize the duchies, presenting themselves as protectors of German interests. Crowds cheered, believing unity was coming. But the joint administration of the territories soon became a quarrel, setting the stage for the Austro-Prussian War. By 1866, Prussia struck its decisive blow, defeating Austria at Königgrätz and expelling it from German affairs. For Bavaria and Württemberg, who had sided with Austria, the defeat was bitter. They were forced into treaties binding them to Prussia's leadership. Quirky note: after Königgrätz, Bavarian soldiers reportedly muttered that they'd rather drink sour beer for a year than ever march beside Prussians again. But treaties signed in Berlin left them little choice. Their armies now operated under Prussian command in war, though they clung fiercely to separate uniforms in peace. The final act came with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Bismarck, ever the strategist, manipulated diplomatic tensions with France until Emperor Napoleon III declared war. This time, Bavarian and Württemberg troops marched alongside Prussians, united not by love but by necessity. At Sedan in September 1870, Napoleon III was captured, and French forces collapsed. The victory electrified Germans everywhere. Crowds in Munich, Stuttgart and Berlin erupted in celebration, newspapers proclaiming that German unity was no longer a dream but a fact. Mainstream fact: on January 18th, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor. The kings of Bavaria and Württemberg, along with other princes, stood beside him. It was a stunning moment. Germany united at last, not under liberal ideals, but under Prussian dominance. The empire was a federation, yes, but its crown rested in Berlin. Picture the scene in Versailles. Gilded mirrors reflecting uniforms, plumed helmets and banners. Bismarck in his white cuirassier uniform, eyes gleaming, King Ludwig II of Bavaria absent, sending envoys instead, his reluctance whispered about by courtiers. When Wilhelm accepted the imperial title, cheers echoed through the hall, mingling with the humiliation of France. Outside, Paris was besieged, starving citizens gnawing on whatever food they could find, while Germans toasted unity. Historians still argue about this founding moment. Was it a triumph of national destiny, or a manipulation by Bismarck? Was it unity, or submission to Prussia? Perhaps both. What is certain is that the empire's birth carried contradictions. Federal rights for Bavaria and Württemberg, but overwhelming dominance by Prussia. Cheers for unity, but underlying resentments. The new empire meant change for all three monarchies. Prussia's king was now emperor, towering above the rest. Bavaria kept its cultural pride, staging festivals and asserting its Catholic identity. Württemberg maintained its constitutional quirks, balancing local rights with imperial obligations. All three wore crowns inside the same empire, but none wore them comfortably. Quirky fringe tidbit. After 1871, Bavarian and Württemberg post offices still issued their own stamps for decades. A collector leafing through albums might find a Bavarian stamp depicting King Ludwig, or a Württemberg issue with its coat of arms, even though both were technically German. Imagine mailing a letter from Munich to Berlin with a Bavarian stamp, a small but stubborn reminder. We are German? Yes, but we are also Bavarian. So as you leave Versailles and the echoes of cheers, you carry with you the image of three monarchies stepping uneasily into a shared empire. Prussia, triumphant, striding like a colossus. Bavaria, muttering but complying. Württemberg balancing on its constitutional rope. The German Empire has been born, but beneath the celebration lies the whisper of future tensions. How long can crowns coexist under one imperial shadow before cracks appear? The cheers in Versailles echo faintly as you step forward into the new German Empire. At first the sound feels triumphant, but soon it mutates into arguments, sermons, and political speeches. Germany is united on paper, yes, but beneath the imperial crown lies a storm of division. Between Catholic and Protestant, liberal and conservative, monarch and parliament. In Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg alike, the decades after 1871 pulse, with cultural conflict and uneasy compromise. You are no longer in an age of kings alone, but in a society where ideas march as fiercely as armies. You sense it immediately in Berlin. Chancellor Bismarck, the architect of unification, has not retired to sip champagne. He is restless, determined to shape the empire into something durable. To him, the Catholic Church represents a rival power within his shiny new state. The Pope commands loyalty that stretches across borders, and Catholic bishops wield authority over millions of German subjects, especially in Bavaria and the Rhineland. Bismarck, wary of divided loyalties, launches the Kulturkampf, the culture struggle. Mainstream fact: between 1871 and 1878, the Kulturkampf introduced laws expelling Jesuits, placing education under state control and requiring state approval for clerical appointments. Bishops who resisted were fined or jailed. Priests who defied the state were hauled before courts. The aim was to subordinate the church to imperial authority. Picture a Bavarian village during these years. The priest refuses to swear loyalty to state laws, so police arrive to escort him away. Villagers weep, clinging to his robes, while officials grimly march him into custody. In Württemberg, Lutherans nod approvingly. This feels like progress, a modern state asserting itself. But in Bavaria's Catholic heartland, it feels like persecution. Families gather in beer halls afterward, raising steins in angry toasts, muttering that Berlin has no right to dictate faith. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, Catholics defiantly built emergency chapels in barns or private homes, where priests said mass in secret. Parishioners brought makeshift altars, hiding chalices under beds when inspectors came. Imagine slipping into a barn at dawn, candles flickering against hay bales, a priest whispering Latin prayers while villagers kneel in muddy boots. These clandestine services became acts of resistance, weaving faith even tighter into local identity. The Kulturkampf backfired. Instead of weakening Catholicism, it galvanized it. The Catholic Centre Party surged in the Reichstag, uniting voters from Bavaria, Württemberg and the Rhineland. By the late 1870s, Bismarck realized he had made a strategic blunder. He shifted focus, reconciling with Catholics to fight a new perceived threat: socialism. Thus, the first great compromise of the empire emerged. Religion was given breathing room in exchange for Catholic loyalty to the state, at least on paper. Meanwhile, Bavaria continued to resist in its own cultural ways. Its Catholicism remained a badge of pride. Processions, pilgrimages, and Marian feasts grew even more elaborate, as if to thumb their noses at Berlin. Oktoberfest swelled, folk costumes flourished, and artists painted pastoral alpine scenes in defiance of Prussian modernity. Historians still argue whether this was genuine cultural revival or deliberate political theatre, orchestrated by monarchs to resist absorption. Either way, Bavaria became a cultural counterweight, balancing Berlin's iron with its own faith and festivity. In Württemberg, the balancing act continued. The kingdom, predominantly Protestant, was less ruffled by the Kulturkampf, but still wary of Berlin's dominance. Its parliament prided itself on constitutional traditions, and its politicians manoeuvred carefully. Stuttgart became a place of debate, compromise, and occasionally surprising radicalism. The Social Democratic Party gained followers among factory workers, demanding rights and reforms that alarmed monarchs everywhere. You can almost hear a Württemberg worker in a tavern, nursing a mug of wine, declaring that emperors and kings are old relics, while his neighbour shakes his head, warning him not to shout too loudly. Quirky note: Württemberg newspapers sometimes publish political cartoons poking fun at Prussians, depicting them as stiff, humourless soldiers, contrasted with Swabians as thrifty but cheerful vintners. It was gentle mockery, but it revealed a persistent undercurrent. Even within the empire, local identity resisted Berlin's gravity. Prussia, meanwhile, surged ahead industrially. Railways expanded, factories multiplied, and Berlin glittered with modern boulevards. But urban growth created new tensions: slums, strikes, and socialist rallies. Bismarck cracked down with anti-socialist laws in 1878, banning meetings and publications. Yet he also pioneered social insurance programs, healthcare, accident insurance, pensions, hoping to undercut socialist appeal. Historians still argue whether Bismarck was cynical or far-sighted. Was he bribing workers with benefits, or laying foundations for the welfare state? Perhaps both. The monarchs of Bavaria and Württemberg adapted in their own ways. King Ludwig II was gone by the 1880s, drowned in mystery, leaving his successors to govern a Bavaria caught between tradition and empire. The regent Luitpold, practical and popular, focused on stability, allowing Munich's cultural life to flourish. Art Nouveau café, avant-garde painters, and bohemian writers thrived alongside Catholic processions, a blend of modernity and tradition unique to Bavaria. In Württemberg, King Charles died in 1891, succeeded by his cousin William II, the last king of Württemberg. He presided over a kingdom modest in power but steady in governance, carefully negotiating with Berlin while preserving Württemberg's identity. His reign reflected the kingdom itself. Not dramatic, not grand, but durable. Quirky fringe tidbit: William II of Württemberg was known for his love of dogs, specifically dachshunds. He kept dozens, often photographed with them, earning him the affectionate nickname the King of Dachshunds. Imagine imperial ceremonies in Berlin, stiff with Prussian protocol, while Württemberg's monarch stood with a small dog tucked under his arm. It was a reminder that even in high politics, personalities mattered and local charm could soften imperial formality. By the turn of the 20th century, the German Empire was a patchwork of compromises. Prussia dominated militarily and politically, but Bavaria and Württemberg clung to their reserved rights and cultural distinctiveness. The Kulturkampf had failed, but it left behind a legacy of suspicion between Berlin and Catholic regions. Socialism had risen, resisted by repression and concessions. Monarchs still wore crowns, but parliaments grew louder. Historians still argue whether the empire was truly unified or simply held together by force and compromise. Was Germany a nation, or an uneasy federation under Prussia's boot? For the Bavarians celebrating Oktoberfest, the Württembergers debating in Stuttgart, and the Prussians marching in Berlin, the answer likely varied. Unity existed, but beneath it simmered resistance, adaptation, and endless negotiation. As you step away from the debates and parades, the sound of brass bands mingles with factory whistles, church bells with socialist chants. The empire is alive, restless, and conflicted. You sense that crowns still glitter, but their lustre is dulled by constant compromises. The monarchies of Prussia, Bavaria, and Württemberg endure, but they no longer stand as unshakable pillars. They balance on shifting ground, bracing for storms yet to come. The echoes of Kulturkampf sermons and socialist rallies still hum in your ears as you step into the twilight years of the 19th century. Now the German Empire glitters on the surface like polished brass, yet underneath you can feel the hum of unease. Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg each shine in their own ways, but all three know that the brightness hides cracks. You're walking along boulevards lit with electric lamps, marvelling at shop windows filled with modern luxuries, while just around the corner, workers mutter about wages, farmers grumble about prices, and monarchs quietly dread the restless tides of change. Berlin dazzles first. Once a provincial garrison, it has become a metropolis. Boulevards lined with department stores, opera houses and cafes. Electric trams clang through the streets, and the first motorcars sputter past horse-drawn carriages. The Reichstag building, completed in 1894, rises with its glass dome gleaming in the sun. You step inside and hear debates echoing in the chamber, where social democrats, Catholic centrists and conservatives clash with words instead of bayonets. Prussia still dominates, but here other voices shout too. The glitter of the empire is political theatre, with anxiety brewing behind every speech. Mainstream fact: by 1912, the Social Democratic Party, SPD, was the largest party in the Reichstag. That terrified monarchs across Germany. For Prussia's king, also German Emperor Wilhelm II, the idea that socialists commanded the largest popular vote felt like a sword dangling above his throne. He still held executive power, but the democratic tide was undeniable. Quirky tidbit: Wilhelm II, unlike his cautious grandfather, adored the limelight. He loved uniforms, parades, and making flamboyant speeches. He posed endlessly for portraits, sometimes wearing naval uniforms though his empire's navy was still fledgling. His restless energy earned him nicknames. Critics whispered about his theatre monarchy as if he were more actor than ruler. You imagine him striding through Berlin with his upturned moustache, declaring destiny in every gesture, while nervous ministers trail behind, cleaning up after his reckless remarks. Bavaria glittered differently. Munich thrived as a cultural capital, balancing Catholic tradition with modern flair. Under Prince Regent Luitpold, who governed from 1886 to 1912, the city bloomed with Art Nouveau architecture, vibrant theatres, and avant-garde artists in Schwäbing cafes. Painters like Franz von Stuck pushed bold styles, while writers and musicians debated philosophy over beer. Oktoberfest grew even larger, a carnival of identity and indulgence. To outsiders, Munich looked confident, but beneath the laughter was unease. Bavarians grumbled about Prussian dominance in the empire, about Berlin's interference in church matters, about industrialization disrupting village life. Resistance was quieter now, cloaked in culture rather than open defiance. Württemberg's glitter was subtler, more bourgeois. Stuttgart grew into a centre of engineering and innovation. Daimler and Maybach tested horseless carriages in Cannstatt, planting seeds of the modern automobile industry. Workshops hummed with precision tools, universities expanded, and middle-class prosperity grew. But even here, anxiety flickered. Farmers feared being left behind, and urban workers flirted with socialism. King William II, dachshund at his side, walked a careful line, patronising science and education, but wary of radical demands. His court lacked the drama of Berlin or Munich, but its modest stability concealed the same tremors. Historians still argue whether Wilhelm II's flamboyant reign made the empire more confident or more brittle. Was his restless energy a strength, projecting Germany's power abroad, or a weakness, alienating allies and inflaming enemies? The truth, as always, lies in the tension. At home, his love of pageantry distracted from unresolved social questions. Abroad, his naval arms race with Britain and erratic diplomacy unsettled Europe. The glitter of new battleships in Kiel's harbour only deepened the anxiety of neighbours. Meanwhile, society itself was changing at a dizzying pace. Railways expanded even further. Electric lights flickered in villages, telephones connected cities. Women pressed for greater education and rights, slowly entering professions once barred to them. The SPD gained strength among workers, while Catholics remained loyal to the Centre Party. In beer halls, in factories, in parish halls, Germans debated what it meant to be part of this empire. Subjects of kings, citizens of a nation, or workers in a global economy. Quirky fringe tidbit. In Munich, bohemian artists staged flying tables at cafes, where they satirized politics by literally flipping tables during debates. Locals laughed, but officials frowned, muttering about disorder. It was both comedy and critique, a reminder that glittering culture carried an edge of rebellion. Anxiety also flowed from abroad. Germany, late to colonialism, scrambled for overseas possessions in Africa and the Pacific. Prussia's generals boasted of empire, while Bavarians and Württembergers grumbled that these faraway adventures brought little benefit to them. Posters in Berlin proclaimed a place in the sun, but in Stuttgart shopkeepers wondered why taxes rose for colonies they would never see. The glitter of imperial expansion sparked pride for some, dread for others. By the early 20th century, the empire glowed with prosperity and culture, yet its monarchs felt uneasy. They wore crowns that glittered but sat heavily. Prussia's emperor staged parades, Bavaria's regents promoted art and faith, Württemberg's kings balanced modestly, but all sensed the currents rising. Democracy, socialism, nationalism and modernity swirled beneath the surface. Historians still argue whether this was Germany's golden age or a fragile facade. The boulevards were grand, the factories booming, the culture dazzling, but the anxieties were just as strong. Strikes shook cities, rural protests spread, and political divisions sharpened. It was as if the empire were a grand ballroom, chandeliers blazing, music swelling, while cracks spread silently across the marble floor. As you leave Berlin's boulevards, Munich's beer halls, and Stuttgart's workshops, you hear both laughter and whispers. Glitter and anxiety, two sides of the same coin, define the monarchies in these final decades before the storm. Crowns still gleam, but shadows lengthen, hinting that their glow may soon be extinguished. The chandeliers of Berlin's boulevards, Munich's beer halls, and Stuttgart's salons still glow faintly in memory. But as you step forward, the light dims. The air grows heavy with coal smoke, hunger, and the pounding of artillery. It is 1914, and Europe has stumbled into catastrophe. For the monarchies of Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg, this war will not merely wound, it will destroy. The crowns that glittered uneasily through the 19th century now totter, and within 4 years they will tumble into the dust. You stand at the threshold of the First World War, hearing the distant rumble of trains carrying soldiers to the front, and you already sense that none of these monarchs will survive what lies ahead. The empire begins the war with confidence, almost with glee. Kaiser Wilhelm II, strutting in his spiked helmet, declares that he knows no parties anymore, only Germans. Crowds cheer in Berlin, Munich and Stuttgart. Even skeptics are swept up in patriotic fervour, convinced the war will be short and victorious. Mainstream fact: German troops marched into Belgium in August 1914, believing they would be in Paris within weeks. In Bavaria, King Ludwig III, who had only recently taken the throne after Prince Regent Luitpold's long stewardship, pledged loyalty to the Kaiser. In Württemberg, King William II sent his troops proudly to the front, their distinct uniforms still marking them as Swabian. The monarchs presented a united front, at least for a moment. But war is not parades. By late 1914, trenches scar the Western Front. Bavarian regiments slog through the mud in Flanders, Württemberg units freeze in Champagne, Prussian divisions bleed at the Marne. You stand ankle-deep in muck, rats scurrying the air thick with cordite and despair. The war that was supposed to be quick has become endless slaughter. Soldiers write letters home, no longer filled with patriotic fervour but with hunger, lice, and hopelessness. Quirky tidbit: Bavarian soldiers in the trenches often smuggled beer from home, their families sending casks or bottles hidden among supplies. Officers frowned, but morale mattered more. Imagine a muddy dugout where soldiers raise a frothy stein, singing old Oktoberfest songs while shells burst above. For a moment, Bavaria's culture softens the horror. Back home, hunger spreads. The British naval blockade chokes Germany's food supply. Potatoes run scarce. Bread is mixed with sawdust. Families boil turnips until they sicken of them. In Berlin, women queue for hours for scraps. In Munich, children faint in schools. In Stuttgart, workers strike, demanding food and peace. The monarchs, once symbols of plenty and stability, now look powerless. Crowns do not fill stomachs. By 1916, even generals overshadow monarchs. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, Prussian officers, become de facto rulers of the empire, their silent dictatorship directing the war. Kaiser Wilhelm II retreats into pomp and empty gestures, while King Ludwig III and King William II watch helplessly as their kingdoms bleed. Historians still argue whether Wilhelm II lost power willingly or was sidelined by force. Either way, the emperor becomes a figurehead while the real power shifts to the military machine. In Bavaria, resistance grows. Catholic leaders criticize the endless bloodshed, while radicals in Munich whisper about revolution. Ludwig III, old and cautious, struggles to inspire. He visits hospitals, hands out medals, but his presence cannot mask shortages or grief. In Württemberg, King William II remains personally popular, known for his modesty and affection for his people. Yet even his warmth cannot shield Stuttgart from strikes, hunger and despair. Quirky fringe tidbit. In 1917, Stuttgart hosted clandestine socialist meetings where young radicals debated overthrowing monarchies entirely. Among them were figures who would later shape the Weimar Republic. Imagine smoke-filled back rooms where fiery speeches mix with the clink of cheap wine glasses, the air charged with defiance. The monarchs above never suspected how close the ground beneath them was crumbling. By 1918, the war unravels. The spring offensives fail, Allied tanks roll forward, and German lines collapse. At home, revolution erupts. In Kiel, sailors mutiny. Workers' councils seize control in Berlin. Red flags fly over Munich. Crowds storm through Stuttgart. The monarchs who once seemed eternal now find themselves abandoned by armies, parliaments, and even their servants. Mainstream fact: on November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands, ending the Hohenzollern monarchy in Prussia and the German Empire itself. The same day in Munich, King Ludwig III slipped out of the city disguised in civilian clothes, his monarchy collapsing as revolutionaries proclaimed a Bavarian republic. 2 days later, King William II of Württemberg also abdicated, ending his reign with dignity but no power. 3 monarchies, centuries old, vanished in the span of days. Picture the scenes. In Berlin, crowds surge around the Reichstag, waving flags, cheering speeches about the Republic. The Kaiser's palace looms silent, its windows shuttered. In Munich, Kurt Eisner, a socialist intellectual, declares Bavaria a free state from a balcony, his voice carrying over stunned crowds. In Stuttgart, King William II pens a farewell message, thanking his people and urging peace, before walking quietly into private life with his beloved Dachshunds. No guillotines, no mass violence, just crowns quietly set aside, their weight too heavy to carry in the ruins of war. Historians still argue whether the monarchs could have saved themselves with reform earlier, or whether war made their fall inevitable. Was Wilhelm II doomed by arrogance, Ludwig III by age, William II by circumstance? Or was monarchy itself simply out of place in a world of tanks, telegraphs and mass politics? The debate continues, but the result is clear. By the end of 1918, the crowns of Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg lay shattered. Quirky final tidbit: when Ludwig III fled Munich, he reportedly stopped at a farmhouse and asked for a glass of milk. The farmer's wife, not recognising him, handed it over, muttering about the times being hard. The King of Bavaria, reduced to a weary traveller, sipping milk in obscurity, an image both humbling and poignant. You step back now, the war's roar fading into silence. The palaces still stand, Berlin's Stadtschloss, Munich's Residenz, Stuttgart's Neues Schloss, but their thrones are empty. The monarchies that had defined centuries are gone, replaced by a fragile republic. The crowns glitter no more, they lie in dusty cases, relics of an age swept away by hunger, shells and revolution. And so your journey ends, tracing the paths of Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg, from modest rises to glittering heights, from splendour to collapse. You've walked through marshes drilled by Prussian sergeants, through Bavarian beer halls echoing with brass bands, through Württemberg's cautious parliaments, and finally through trenches and breadlines. You've seen crowns shimmer and topple, monarchs dream and despair. Now the noise fades, the lights dim, the crowns are gone. All that remains is memory, and the soft hum of history whispering that even the mightiest thrones rest on fragile ground. And now, as the echoes of war and revolution fade, let yourself breathe more slowly. The crowns have toppled, the palaces are hushed, and the kings have slipped into history. You can almost picture the empty thrones, gathering dust in quiet halls, while outside the seasons roll on as they always have. Snow on Bavarian mountains, blossoms in Württemberg vineyards, mist over the Prussian fields. The noise of politics and armies drifts away, leaving only the steady rhythm of life. You've wandered a long path tonight, through iron drills and golden palaces, through Oktoberfest tents and parliamentary debates, through castles in the clouds and trenches in the mud. The monarchies of Prussia, Bavaria and Württemberg rose, glittered and fell, their stories woven into the broader tapestry of Europe. Now their crowns sit in museums, their castles house tourists, and their names linger in songs, stamps and memories. The world has moved on, yet their echoes still murmur in the corners of history. As you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself walking one last time through a quiet Bavarian village, the church bells marking the hour, or along a Württemberg vineyard path as dusk settles, or perhaps across a Prussian meadow with only the sound of the wind. The monarchs are gone, but the landscapes remain, soothing, eternal. Let your breath slow, your thoughts soften. The stories of kings and empires can wait until tomorrow. For now you are safe, wrapped in the quiet certainty that history is always both storm and calm, both glitter and silence. The crowns may fall, but the night is gentle and it welcomes you.